Stand on the eastern shore of Britain at the end of the Ice Age, and the sea is gone. There is no grey horizon, no cold North Sea breaking against cliffs, no channel separating one island from another continent. Beyond the low ground, the land continues eastward beneath a pale sky. Rivers twist through wide valleys. Marshes shimmer where meltwater gathers. Herds move across open grass and scrub, following routes that have existed for generations. Farther east, the same ground leads toward what will one day be the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. Britain is not yet an island. It is the western edge of a larger world, and the world between is not empty. This lost country is now called Doggerland, a modern name for an ancient landscape whose boundaries shifted as ice, rivers, plants, animals, and people responded to a warming planet. At the coldest stage of the last glaciation, so much water is locked in continental ice sheets that global sea level lies far below its modern position. The floor of the present North Sea stands exposed to the air. What is now crossed by cargo ships and fishing vessels is then a dry land, broken by channels, wetlands, low ridges, and river basins. It is not a single flat bridge laid conveniently between Britain and Europe. It is a region in its own right, large enough to contain different habitats, routes, and perhaps human territories. The temptation is to imagine it as bleak tundra, a windswept corridor used only by animals and hunters moving between safer places. For part of its history, some areas may indeed have looked stark and cold. The climate at the end of the Pleistocene is unstable. Grasses, dwarf shrubs, and open steppe expand during colder phases. Reindeer, wild horses, and other large mammals move through broad country where tree cover is limited. Yet this is only one face of Doggerland. As temperatures rise and ecological zones shift northward, the land becomes more varied. Birch and pine establish themselves in some places. Wetlands spread along slow rivers. Later, richer woodland communities take hold. Recent sedimentary ancient DNA research suggests that parts of southern Doggerland supported habitable forests much earlier than once assumed, with oak, elm, and hazel appearing in the environmental record from roughly 16,000 years ago onward. The exact pattern remains incomplete, but the implication is powerful. This was not exposed seabed waiting to be drowned. It was a living country with its own ecological history. From the western heights, rivers descend toward the lowlands. The Thames does not end where London will one day stand. Other river systems from Britain and continental Europe extend into the broad basin, joining waterways whose channels are now buried under marine sediments. Some feed lakes and marshes, others carve valleys toward a distant northern coastline. In colder centuries, as meltwater and seasonal floods reshape their banks. In warmer periods, vegetation thickens around them. River terraces become travel routes. Raised ground offers dry resting places and views across the landscape. Low ground offers reeds, fish, waterfowl, edible plants, and raw materials. The geography is restless, but it is generous. To people living there, the region would not have appeared as a future archaeological puzzle or a doomed land bridge. It would have been understood through paths, smells, seasons, animal movements, safe crossings, and remembered places. A bend in a river might matter more than any distant boundary. A stand of hazel could signal food at the right time of year. A gravel ridge might remain dry when surrounding ground turned wet. Families and small communities may have returned to familiar places over generations. carrying knowledge that existed only in memory and practice. No written map survives, and the evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in the record suggests repeated human presence across landscapes later lost beneath the sea. Doggerland also occupies a climate frontier. To the north, ice sheets and cold seas still influence weather and drainage. To the south, temperate plants and animals advance as the climate softens. The result is not a smooth transformation, but a sequence of openings and retreats. During warmer episodes, woodland spreads. During colder reversals, open habitats return. One severe interruption comes with the Younger Dryas, beginning roughly 12,900 years ago, when temperatures in the North Atlantic region fall sharply after a period of warming. The change does not freeze all of Doggerland into a uniform wilderness, but it alters the balance of habitats and the opportunities available to people. Then warmth returns, forests expand, wetlands deepen. The sea, still distant in the imagination of any single generation, begins its slow approach. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The central mystery begins with a distortion created by the modern map. Looking at Britain today, it feels natural to see an island with permanent edges. The coastline appears fixed, almost timeless. Yet coastlines are temporary arrangements. During the thousands of years in which Doggerland exists, the line between land and sea is continually renegotiated. Bays form where valleys flood, shorelines migrate inland, freshwater marshes become brackish, dry paths turn soft and unreliable. What looks stable in one generation may be altered in the next. Still, it would be a mistake to begin the story with disappearance alone. For much of its existence, Doggerland is not a remnant. It is extensive, productive, and connected. From Britain, people can move eastward without boats across terrain that may take days or weeks to cross. Animals follow the same broad pathways. Plants spread through them. Ideas, tools, and customs can move with human groups whose lives are not divided by borders later drawn on maps. The region links Western and Northern Europe, but it also contains its own centre river valleys, wetland basins, wooded ridges, and coastlines rich enough to sustain repeated occupation. The scale is difficult to recover because almost every familiar reference point is wrong. Modern cities stand far from the ancient shore. Offshore sandbanks were once hills or uplands. Channels used by ships were valleys crossed by animals. The place now known as Dogger Bank, a shallow area in the North Sea, preserves the name most closely associated with the drowned landscape, but it offers only a fragment of what once existed. At different moments, Doggerland may have covered an area comparable to a modern European country. Its outline changed repeatedly, and scholars still debate the precise shape of its rivers, coastlines, and habitable zones at particular dates. Yet uncertainty does not make the landscape less real. Beneath layers of sand and marine mud remain traces of soil, peat, pollen, plant DNA, animal bone, and human workmanship. They belong to a world where wind moves through grass and woodland. Water slips through channels, birds gather over wetlands, and large animals cross open ground. Smoke may rise from a camp on a low ridge. Footprints may press briefly into damp sediment before rain and flooding erase them. Nothing in that moment suggests that the entire horizon will one day become sea. That is the first truth of Doggerland before it vanished. It lived. It had weather, seasons, hazards, resources, and remembered places. It was crossed, but it was also inhabited. It connected Britain to Europe, but it was more than the space between them. To understand what was lost, the sea must be removed from the map, and the land beneath it allowed to return not as a blank bridge, but as a country. For thousands of years after the water closed over Doggerland, ships crossed above it without knowing the shape of the country below. Sailors measured depth because shallow banks could wreck a vessel. Fishermen learned where nets would snag, and storms occasionally threw dark lumps of ancient peat onto modern beaches. The North Sea was treated as water, weather, and danger. Its buried valleys and forests had no place on ordinary maps. Yet the vanished landscape never disappeared completely. It remained sealed beneath sand, mud, and moving currents, releasing fragments whenever human activity cut deeply enough into the seabed. Some of the earliest clues arrived in fishing nets, trawlers working the shallow waters between Britain and continental Europe, sometimes hauled up bones too large and too old to belong to modern North Sea animals. Mammoth teeth, antlers, the remains of wild cattle, and other Pleistocene creatures emerged among fish and shells. Many objects were discarded before anyone understood their importance. To a working crew, a waterlogged bone might be an inconvenience rather than an archaeological discovery. Others were kept as curiosities, traded, displayed in harbours, or passed to local collectors. Piece by piece, the seabed began to reveal that the sea had once been land. One of the most famous discoveries came in the early 20th century, when a fishing vessel working east of the Norfolk coast brought up a finely made barbed point carved from antler. Known through the vessel that recovered it, the object became associated with the name Kalinda. Its exact original location and context could not be reconstructed with archaeological precision because a trawl does not excavate layer by layer. It drags across the bottom, mixing materials and removing them from their surroundings. Even so, the point was unmistakably human workmanship. It resembled Mesolithic hunting or fishing implements known from dryland sites. Something made by a person thousands of years earlier had been recovered from the middle of the North Sea. The object changed the tone of the evidence. Animal bones could prove that exposed land once existed, but a shaped antler point implied a human landscape. Somewhere beneath the waves, people had selected the material, cut it, shaped it as barbs, and perhaps attached it to a shaft. It might have been used for fishing, hunting, or working in wetland environments. Scholars still debate the exact function of many such tools, especially when they have been removed from their original setting. But the larger conclusion is difficult to avoid. Human beings had not merely crossed the exposed basin, they had worked, hunted, and left possessions there. Dredging added more clues. Vast quantities of sand and gravel are removed from the North Sea for construction and coastal engineering. This industrial activity reaches into sediments that preserve ancient landscapes. Workers and collectors began noticing flint tools, animal bones, fragments of wood, and dark blocks of peat among dredged material. Some finds came ashore far from the location where they had first rested, mixed into aggregate deposited on beaches or building sites. Archaeologists faced an unusual problem. The artifacts were genuine, but their geographical and sedimentary context had been partly lost. Even without perfect context, patterns accumulated. Brown Bank, a shallow ridge in the southern North Sea, became especially important because dredging and fishing repeatedly produced prehistoric material from the surrounding area. Barbed points, flint artifacts, and animal remains suggested that the bank and nearby lowlands had once formed part of a resource-rich environment. The modern ridge may preserve only a fraction of the ancient topography, and currents have reworked many deposits. But repeated discoveries showed that the submerged landscape was not archaeologically empty. Peat offered another kind of testimony. Unlike an isolated bone or tool, peat forms within living environments. It accumulates where waterlogged conditions slow the decay of plants, preserving organic material, pollen, seeds, insects, and chemical signals from past ecosystems. Fishermen sometimes called pieces of submerged peat moorlog, recognizing it as something different from ordinary seabed mud. To geologists and archaeologists, these dark deposits were remnants of marshes, bogs, and low-lying ground that had existed before marine water took over. A block of peat lifted from the seabed could contain the compressed remains of a vanished wetland. Pollen grains might reveal nearby trees. Plant fragments could indicate freshwater conditions. Microscopic organisms could show whether water had been fresh, brackish, or fully marine. In some deposits, transitions from terrestrial soil to wetland peat and then to marine sediment recorded the advance of the sea almost like pages laid one above another. The evidence remained incomplete because currents, erosion, and later deposition disturbed many areas, but submerged sediments began to provide something artifacts alone could not: environmental context. The greatest transformation came when researchers stopped treating the North Sea floor as a blank surface and began mapping what lay beneath it. During the 20th century, especially with the expansion of offshore oil and gas exploration, companies collected enormous quantities of seismic data. Sound waves were sent through the seabed, and their echoes revealed buried layers, channels, ridges, and geological boundaries. These surveys were designed to locate energy resources, not prehistoric camps. Yet they unintentionally created one of the largest archives ever assembled for the study of a drowned landscape. When archaeologists and geoscientists gained access to portions of this information, the vanished country began to take form. Beneath the modern seabed appeared networks of ancient rivers, some stretching across great distances. Tributaries joined larger channels. Basins suggested former lakes or wetlands. Ridges may once have formed dry corridors. Depressions preserved thick sediment sequences. Instead of a featureless plain, researchers saw a complex topography comparable to landscapes still visible on land. The reconstruction was never as simple as tracing a single ancient coastline. Doggerland changed continually. A map representing one date might be misleading only a few centuries later. As sea level rose, river mouths migrated, valleys flooded, and new estuaries cut into the land. Some areas eroded while others accumulated sediment. Glacial deposits created uneven ground that could remain dry after surrounding lowlands had become marsh. Computer models therefore had to combine seabed elevation, geological history, sea level estimates, and knowledge of how the land itself had moved after the weight of the ice sheets diminished. Sediment cores allowed scientists to test the maps. A core is a narrow vertical sample taken through layers beneath the seabed. Each layer may represent a different environment and period. Marine shell fragments near the top can give way to estuarine mud below, followed by freshwater peat, river sand, or an older land surface. Radiocarbon dating provides approximate ages for organic material. Pollen and plant remains help reconstruct vegetation. More recently, sedimentary ancient DNA has revealed biological traces that are invisible even under conventional microscopic study. The new DNA evidence has deepened the picture considerably. Hundreds of samples from dozens of marine cores have been used to identify plants and other organisms that once occupied southern Doggerland. The results indicate that habitable woodland environments existed earlier than many older reconstructions allowed. Oak, elm, hazel, and other trees were not merely late arrivals clinging to the final remnants of land. In parts of the region, their genetic traces suggest an established and productive ecology stretching back toward the close of the Ice Age. No single core can represent the whole country, and DNA can move or survive unevenly in sediments, so the interpretation requires care. Even so, the discovery replaces an old image of emptiness with something more intricate and alive. The seafloor was becoming a historical archive, but an archive written in damaged pages, trawling disturbed sites, dredging removed sediments. Offshore construction cut foundations and laid cables. Natural currents exposed some remains while burying others. Researchers often had to work with data created for purposes unrelated to archaeology. A seismic survey might reveal an ancient river valley, but not the camps once located along its banks. A tool might prove human presence but arrive without its original layer. A core could preserve forest DNA yet miss evidence of people living only a short distance away. Still, the different clues began to reinforce one another. Bones showed which animals had occupied the plain. Tools revealed human workmanship. Peat preserved wetlands. Seismic mapping restored rivers and landforms. Environmental DNA brought back forests that had left no standing trunks. Together they demonstrated that beneath one of the busiest seas in the world lay a landscape large enough to contain histories that would otherwise be missing from Europe's past. The vanished country had not been discovered in a single dramatic moment. It emerged slowly from nets, dredgers, drilling platforms, laboratory samples, and maps assembled from reflected sound. What first looked like scattered debris became evidence of an inhabited world. The North Sea was no longer only the place where Doggerland ended. It was the surface beneath which that world still waited. Once the buried channels are traced, Doggerland stops looking like a single plain and begins to resemble a country organized by water. Rivers determine where animals move, where plants gather, where people travel, and where the first stages of drowning will later begin. They descend from Britain and continental Europe into the broad basin of the southern North Sea, meeting in lowlands that are continually reshaped by cold, thaw, flood, and the slow retreat of ice. Their courses do not remain fixed. A river that cuts deeply through open ground during one climatic phase may spread into braided channels during another, then become a lake, marsh, estuary, or submerged valley as the sea advances. The modern Thames gives only a shortened impression of its ancient reach. Before the North Sea takes its present form, the river continues far beyond the coastline of eastern England. Other British rivers do the same. To the east and southeast, the Rhine, Meuse, and Scheldt systems carry water and sediment from continental Europe toward the basin. Their channels sometimes join larger drainage networks, though scholars still debate the exact connections at different dates. Farther north and west, smaller waterways cut through glacial deposits and feed wetlands that have no modern equivalent. The southern North Sea becomes a meeting place for rivers that now appear separated by open water. These waterways are more than lines on a map. Their floodplains create some of the richest environments in the region. During colder periods, channels carry meltwater and large loads of sand and gravel. Their banks may be unstable, shifting after seasonal floods and leaving behind bars, islands, and abandoned bends. As the climate warms, the rivers slow in places. Fine mud settles in shallow basins. Plants colonize the margins. Reeds, sedges, and low shrubs spread where water remains close to the surface. oxbow lakes form when channels change direction. Small pools become breeding grounds for fish, amphibians, insects, and water birds. For human communities, such landscapes offer both abundance and difficulty. Fresh water is available, but the safest crossing point may change after every flood. Fish and birds gather in predictable seasons, but low ground can become impassable. Dry ridges near rivers provide places to camp, watch animal movements, and return repeatedly. Gravel terraces offer flint nodules or access to nearby raw materials. Wood from river margins can be shaped into shafts, traps, handles, and structures, though very little survives unless it is quickly buried in waterlogged sediment. The waterways also carry memory. A group moving through Doggerland may know a river not by its full length, but by a sequence of useful places a shallow crossing, a bend where fish collect, a stand of hazel, a patch of higher ground that remains dry after rain. These routes would not need written names to become deeply familiar. Knowledge could be renewed through seasonal return. What survives in the record suggests mobility, but mobility does not mean aimless wandering. Movement can be structured, deliberate, and tied to landscapes known across generations. As temperatures rise after the last glacial maximum, the rivers enter a period of profound change. Melting ice contributes water to the oceans, but it also alters regional drainage. Some channels receive pulses of sediment and meltwater. Others lose their glacial sources and become slower, more meandering systems. Vegetation stabilizes certain banks. Floodplains widen. Areas that were once open and windswept begin to support patches of woodland. The combination of rivers, forest edges, grasslands, and wetlands creates an ecological mosaic rather than one uniform habitat. This variety matters because different animals use different parts of the landscape. Large grazers prefer open ground and river meadows. Deer move between woodland and clearing. Wild cattle seek productive lowlands but can cross considerable distances. Boar favour wooded and marshy zones. Beaver alter streams by building dams, slowing water, and creating new pools. Their work can transform a narrow channel into a wetland complex, changing the distribution of fish, plants, and birds. A seemingly minor animal presence may therefore reshape the land at a scale that matters to humans. Lakes add another layer, some form in glacial hollows, others in abandoned river channels or poorly drained depressions. Their shorelines may attract repeated activity because they concentrate resources. Fish can be taken in shallow water. Birds arrive seasonally. Reeds and other wetland plants provide food and material. Animals approach to drink. A lake also becomes a navigational landmark in country where woodland may increasingly limit long-distance views. Yet these water-rich environments are never static. This same low elevation that makes them productive also makes them vulnerable. Sea level rise first reaches Doggerland not as a wall of water but through river valleys. Saltwater pushes inland along channels. Tides begin to influence places that were once entirely freshwater. Estuaries widen. Marsh plants adapted to brackish conditions replace older vegetation. A river mouth may move several kilometers over generations, turning former inland camps into coastal sites and then into tidal flats. The process is easy to underestimate because sea level does not rise at a perfectly steady rate. Recent reconstructions of the early Holocene show intervals of faster increase, including important accelerations around 10,000, 308,300 years ago. In some phases, the average rise may approach 8 or 9 millimeters in a year. That number sounds small when imagined against a single season, but across a century it becomes close to a metre, on an extremely low and gently sloping landscape. A relatively modest vertical rise can translate into a dramatic horizontal retreat of the coast. Land movement complicates the picture further. The great ice sheets had pressed northern parts of Europe downward, while areas beyond their margins responded differently. As the ice melted, the crust adjusted. Some regions rose, others subsided in relation to the sea. Doggerland's coastline therefore reflects both increasing ocean volume and the slow movement of the land itself. No single global sea level curve can capture every local change. Researchers must reconstruct where the ground stood, how sediments compacted, and how tides altered flooded valleys. The rivers become the earliest corridors of loss. A valley can funnel marine water deep into the interior while nearby ridges remain dry. Freshwater wetlands become brackish before open sea surrounds them. Communities living on higher ground may watch changes unfold below without immediately losing their own camps. Paths shift inland. Fishing practices adapt. Areas once crossed on foot require rafts or boats. What begins as environmental adjustment gradually changes the geography of connection. In some locations, rising water may initially increase opportunity. Expanding estuaries are productive ecosystems. Tidal creeks hold fish and shellfish. Mudflats attract birds. Salt marsh can support large numbers of animals. The boundary between land and sea becomes a rich zone rather than merely a threat. Mesolithic communities elsewhere in northwestern Europe show sophisticated use of coasts, rivers, and wetlands. So the people of Doggerland were not helpless before changing water. They could alter routes, move camps, and exploit newly formed habitats. But adaptation has limits. As valleys flood, the land between them narrows. A broad plain becomes a series of peninsulas divided by estuaries. Lakes merge with tidal channels. Marshes expand over places that once supported dry woodland. River networks that formerly connected the interior begin to separate one patch of land from another. The change may be almost imperceptible in a single lifetime, yet unmistakable across several generations. A camp remembered as inland by one generation may stand beside brackish water for the next. A hunting route may end at a new channel. A ridge once used to cross the lowlands may become an island during high tides. The sea does not simply cover Doggerland from its outer edge. It enters through the country's veins. This is why the rivers matter so deeply to the story. They make Doggerland habitable long before they help break it apart. They feed forests, wetlands, animals, and human movement. They preserve sediment and organic traces that allow the drowned world to be reconstructed. Then, as climate warms and oceans rise, the same valleys guide saltwater inland. The landscape that once gathered around its rivers begins to fragment along them, and the first outlines of the future North Sea appear inside the old land. The land now becomes greener, denser, and more difficult to see across. Open glacial country does not vanish everywhere at once, but woodland spreads into valleys, along river margins, and across ground that had once supported mostly grass, scrub, and cold-adapted plants. Birch is often among the first trees to establish itself after colder phases. Pine follows in suitable soils. Later, hazel, elm, oak, and other temperate species form richer woodland communities in parts of southern Doggerland. The exact timing differs from place to place, and the evidence remains incomplete. Yet the newer sedimentary DNA record makes one conclusion increasingly difficult to dismiss: substantial areas of Doggerland became ecologically productive long before the final flooding. This transformation changes everything about how the landscape feels. A broad horizon breaks into enclosed spaces. Paths narrow between trees. Damp ground darkens beneath leaf litter. In low places, reeds rise above still water while alder and willow crowd the edges of channels. On better drained ridges, hazel thickets produce dense seasonal food. Oak and elm spread where soil and climate allow. Forest does not form one continuous wall. It opens into clearings, river meadows, marshes, wind-throw gaps, and grazing lawns created by animals. Doggerland becomes a shifting mosaic in which woodland, wetland, grassland, and water lie close together. The abundance of this world is not obvious from a modern map. The North Sea now appears cold, exposed, and largely empty except for vessels, wind farms, and offshore platforms. Yet beneath the water once stood habitats capable of supporting large and varied animal populations. Red deer move along woodland edges, feeding in clearings and retreating into cover. Roe deer favour denser vegetation. Wild cattle, or aurochs, occupy floodplains and open forest. Immense animals whose strength makes them both valuable and dangerous. Wild boar root beneath trees and along wet margins. Elk browse in marshy terrain. Beaver reshape streams. Otters follow fish through channels. Smaller mammals occupy nearly every layer of the habitat, from burrows in dry banks to nests in reeds and tree hollows. Bird life would have been especially rich. Seasonal wetlands attract geese, ducks, cranes, waders, and other water birds in great numbers. Some remain through much of the year. Others arrive and leave according to migrations older than any human settlement. Their movements create a calendar written across the sky. The return of one species may signal changing weather, the approach of spawning fish, or the ripening of certain plants. Feathers, eggs, meat, and bone all have potential uses, though the archaeological record rarely preserves the full range of what people collected. The rivers and lakes hold pike, perch, eel, salmonids where conditions permit, and many smaller fish. Shellfish and aquatic plants become more important where estuaries and tidal flats expand. Frogs, insects, mollusks, and countless organisms occupy the shallow margins. To modern eyes, marshland can look empty or monotonous. To people who understand its cycles, it is full of signals: water level, bird behavior, tracks in mud, plant color, insect emergence, and the smell of changing salinity all reveal what the landscape is doing. Food is distributed unevenly through the year. Hazelnuts may become one of the most dependable autumn resources where hazel grows densely. They can be collected in quantity, roasted, stored for limited periods, and carried. Berries, edible roots, tubers, greens, fungi, and tree products broaden the diet. Some plants offer medicine, fiber, dyes, or adhesive ingredients rather than calories. The ability to identify useful species is part of daily survival, but it also represents accumulated cultural knowledge. A forest may look wild from a distance while being understood intimately through generations of observation. Animal remains preserve only part of this relationship. Bones survive more readily than leaves, baskets, wooden tools, or gathered foods, which can distort the archaeological picture toward hunting. In reality, Mesolithic subsistence was probably highly flexible. Different communities may have emphasized different resources according to season, location, tradition, and opportunity. What survives in the record suggests a broad economy, rather than dependence on one animal or one environment. Doggerland's strength as a homeland lies precisely in the closeness of many habitats. The wooded landscape also affects movement. In open country, large herds can be watched from far away. In forest, animals are heard before they're seen. Tracking becomes a matter of broken twigs, droppings, hoof marks, disturbed leaves, and habitual paths. People may follow game trails through dense cover or clear narrow routes between camps and resource areas. Rivers become even more important as natural corridors because they provide visibility and easier travel along their margins. Small watercraft may allow efficient movement where walking through wet ground is slow, though direct evidence for boats in Doggerland is scarce, because wood survives only under favourable conditions. Elsewhere in Mesolithic Europe, preserved wooden paddles, fish traps, platforms, and dugout canoes show that communities were capable of sophisticated wetland technology. It is reasonable to infer similar skills in Doggerland, but the distinction between evidence and comparison matters. No single surviving object allows researchers to reconstruct an entire way of life. Much of what people made from wood, bark, fibre, skin, and cordage has vanished. The tools lifted from the seabed represent only the most durable edge of a much larger material world. Even fire changes the forest. A campfire provides warmth, light, cooked food, and protection from damp conditions. Controlled burning may also help manage vegetation, open pathways, encourage useful plants, or attract grazing animals to new growth. Although scholars still debate how extensively Mesolithic groups altered northern European landscapes in this way, natural fires also occur, especially in dry periods. Charcoal in sediments can record burning. But separating human action from lightning and climate is not always possible. The environment itself is unstable. Warmer centuries encourage forest expansion, but local flooding can kill trees and create new marsh. Beavers block channels, storms topple woodland, and shifting rivers bury old surfaces. A patch of oak woodland may stand for generations, then become waterlogged as drainage changes. Elsewhere, newly exposed sediment supports fresh vegetation. This constant renewal produces opportunity, but it also demands memory and flexibility. Predators share the landscape. Wolves move through forest and open country. Lynx may hunt in wooded regions. Brown bears occupy parts of northern Europe during this broad period, though their exact distribution across Doggerland at particular times remains uncertain. These animals are not simply threats. They compete for prey, leave tracks that reveal game movement, and occupy important places in the mental worlds of human communities. Without written traditions, their symbolic meanings cannot be recovered with confidence. But it would be surprising if such powerful animals existed only as practical problems. The most imposing creatures are not always predators. An aurochs bull standing at the edge of a marsh can dominate the scene through sheer mass. An elk moving through reeds may disappear almost silently despite its size. Red deer gather during seasonal cycles that change both their behavior and the way humans approach them. Hunting these animals requires knowledge of terrain, wind, group movement, and risk. It is not a simple contest between people and beasts. It is participation in a landscape where every species follows patterns shaped by water, vegetation, and season. Doggerland's forests also challenge the old idea that the region served mainly as a passage between Britain and Europe. A corridor is valuable because it leads elsewhere. A forested wetland country is valuable because it can sustain life where it stands. Its rivers provide fish and transport. Its woodland offers fuel, food, shelter material, and game. Its marshes attract birds and aquatic resources. Its clearings support grazing animals. People may still move widely, but movement does not imply that they are always leaving. The distinction matters because modern language often reduces submerged lands to roots, bridges, or stepping stones. These terms are convenient for explaining migration, but they flatten inhabited places into empty geography. Doggerland may have connected distant regions, yet its ecological diversity could also have drawn people inward. Some groups may have spent long periods within particular river basins. Others may have circulated between inland woodland and seasonal coasts. The sea level rise that eventually destroys the landscape may first make some coastal zones even richer, encouraging continued settlement rather than immediate retreat. In this world, the boundary between safety and danger is rarely clear. Marshes provide food but conceal deep channels. Forests offer shelter but reduce visibility. Rivers guide travel but flood without warning. Large animals support communities but can injure anyone who approaches carelessly. The people living here survive not because the land is gentle, but because it is legible to them. That knowledge leaves almost no direct trace. It survives indirectly in the placement of tools, the selection of camps, the animals taken, and the environments repeatedly visited. Beneath the North Sea, much of that evidence remains buried or scattered. Still, the sediments preserve enough to restore the essential picture. Doggerland was not merely exposed ground between glaciers and ocean. It was a changing green world of forest paths, animal trails, wetlands, smoke, birds, and human memory, a place rich enough to become home. The people of Doggerland left no chronicles, no carved names, no royal tombs, and no monuments rising above the horizon. They did not describe their rivers for later generations or record the boundaries of the places they knew. Everything said about them must be built from fragments that survived by chance: a shaped piece of flint, a barbed point of antler, butchered animal bone, charcoal trapped in sediment, traces of plants gathered or burned, and genetic signals preserved in human remains found beyond the drowned landscape itself. Even the word Mesolithic is not a name they would have recognized. It is a modern label placed over many communities living across northern Europe after the last ice age, groups that may have differed from one another in language, movement, custom, and identity. Their anonymity can make them appear distant and interchangeable, as if one band of hunter-gatherers could stand for all the others. The archaeology suggests something more complicated. Northern Europe during this period is a patchwork of traditions. Stone tools vary in shape, size, and method of manufacture. Different regions favour different hunting equipment, raw materials, and ways of organising camps. Some of these patterns may reflect practical adaptation to local environments. Others may indicate learned traditions passed between generations. A small difference in how a blade is struck from a core, or how a point is shaped, can be as culturally meaningful as a difference in pottery or architecture in later societies, even if its meaning is now impossible to recover. The people moving through Doggerland belong to this wider world, but the sea has removed much of the evidence needed to distinguish them. On dry land, archaeologists can map hearths, post holes, waste deposits, and clusters of tools. Under the North Sea, currents disturb surfaces, dredging mixes deposits, and rising water erodes some sites before burying others. A tool recovered alone may reveal skill and approximate age while saying little about the person who made it. A concentration of artifacts is far more informative, but intact concentrations are difficult to locate and excavate offshore. The record is therefore uneven, and what survives may exaggerate durable stone and antler while silencing almost everything made from wood, hide, fibre, bark, and bone. Flint remains one of the clearest human signatures. It fractures predictably, producing sharp edges useful for cutting meat, scraping hides, shaping wood, and making composite weapons. Mesolithic knappers often create small blades and microliths, carefully shaped pieces that can be set into shafts to form arrows, spears, or cut-in tools. A single point may be tiny, but it represents a sequence of decisions choosing raw material, preparing a core, controlling the strike, modifying the edge, and fitting the finished piece into a larger object. The wooden shaft and adhesive usually disappear. The flint remains, separated from the technology that once gave it purpose. Antler and bone tools preserve a different kind of craftsmanship. Barbed points recovered from the North Sea and neighbouring regions suggest equipment suited to hunting or fishing in water-rich landscapes. Their barbs require patient cutting and abrasion. The maker must understand the strength and grain of the material, selecting a suitable section and avoiding flaws that might cause it to split. Some points may have been attached to shafts with detachable heads, allowing them to remain embedded in prey while a line prevented loss. Others may have served as fixed weapons. Scholars still debate the precise use of individual examples, especially those found without context. But the care invested in them shows technological knowledge far beyond the crude image once associated with Stone Age life. Animal bones offer evidence of human presence when they carry cut marks, impact fractures, burning, or patterns of selection that differ from natural death. Yet even these signs require caution. Currents can move bones. Carnivores leave damage that may resemble human modification. A butchered carcass proves that people acted at a place, but not whether they lived there for an hour, a season, or many years. Repeated finds from the same submerged zone become more persuasive, especially when combined with tools, environmental evidence, and mapped landforms that would have made the location attractive. Human remains from Doggerland itself are exceptionally rare, and this absence shapes the mystery of identity. The acidic conditions of some wetlands dissolve bone. Marine erosion breaks and disperses skeletons. Later sediments bury remains beyond easy reach. Without well-preserved burials, researchers cannot directly examine the health, diet, ancestry, or physical appearance of most of the people who lived there. Instead, they must look to Mesolithic individuals found in Britain and continental Europe, using them as imperfect comparisons for populations that may have crossed or occupied the drowned region. Ancient DNA has transformed this broader picture. Genetic evidence shows that post-glacial Europe was not populated by one fixed people, expanding smoothly across empty land. Different hunter-gatherer ancestries moved, mixed, and replaced one another over long periods. Populations associated with Western Europe spread into newly habitable regions after the ice retreated, while other groups entered from the east and northeast. Britain itself was recolonized more than once as climate and geography changed. Doggerland likely formed part of these movements, but assigning a specific genetic identity to its inhabitants at a particular moment remains difficult without human remains securely recovered from the seabed. The people living there may therefore have changed as much as the landscape. A community occupying a southern river valley 16,000 years ago would not necessarily be directly continuous with people using the same region several thousand years later. New groups could arrive. Existing groups could merge, fragment, or shift their territories. Traditions could spread without large-scale migration, pass through contact, partnership, and exchange. Genetic ancestry, tool style, and cultural identity do not always move together, and no single explanation fully accounts for the patterns visible across Mesolithic Europe. Physical appearance is another area where modern assumptions can mislead. Ancient DNA from individuals elsewhere in Western Europe indicates combinations of traits that do not fit familiar modern categories. Some Mesolithic people carried genetic variants associated with darker skin pigmentation and light eyes, while others differed. These findings are often reduced to striking reconstructions, but they represent individuals rather than a uniform population. Doggerland existed for thousands of years across a large region, so its inhabitants almost certainly varied through time and space. The safest image is not one standardized face, but many communities shaped by changing ancestry, diet, environment, and mobility. Their social worlds are even harder to see. Small hunter-gatherer groups are often imagined as isolated bands, yet archaeological distributions suggest networks extending across considerable distances. Raw materials move far from their geological sources. Similar tool traditions appear across wide regions. People likely met at seasonal gathering places, exchanged knowledge, formed partnerships, and maintained relationships beyond the group travelling together at any one time. Doggerland's central position between Britain, the Low Countries, and southern Scandinavia would have made it an important zone of contact, though the sea has erased many of the sites that could demonstrate how those networks worked. Absence of monuments does not mean absence of memory or belief. Mesolithic communities elsewhere buried some individuals with care, used ochre, arranged grave goods, deposited animal remains in unusual ways, and returned to certain places repeatedly. These acts suggest symbolic traditions, social attachments, and ideas about death, animals, and landscape. Yet it would be reckless to transfer every known practice directly onto Doggerland. The evidence permits the conclusion that its people possessed complex cultural lives. It does not preserve the stories that gave those lives meaning. Footprints would seem the most immediate evidence of all, a direct impression of a human body moving through wet ground. Prehistoric trackways survive at some coastal and estuarine sites around the North Sea basin, where mud was rapidly covered and protected. They show individuals crossing tidal flats, sometimes in groups, leaving stride, direction, and body size recorded for a moment. Comparable traces may exist beneath the sea, but finding them would require extraordinary preservation and precise investigation. Most steps vanished within hours. Their disappearance is a reminder that human presence was once far greater than the archaeological count of surviving objects. The people of Doggerland are therefore visible mainly through consequences. Stone changes shape under their hands. Antler becomes technology. Bones are cut and broken. Fire leaves charcoal. Materials move across the landscape. Camps alter the distribution of debris. Genetic lineages pass through later populations. None of this gives back their names, but it removes them from abstraction. They were not merely representatives of a period between the Ice Age and farming. They were individuals who learned roots, recognized faces, remembered losses, judged weather, and understood the behavior of animals with a precision that modern observers would struggle to match. Some were born on land that remained dry throughout their lives. Others may have watched familiar marshes turn tidal. Their world survives without their voices, and every attempt to reconstruct them must balance imagination against the stubborn limits of evidence. That silence is not emptiness. It is the result of preservation, distance, and the later sea. Beneath the North Sea lies the damaged record of people who belonged to Doggerland before anyone knew it would disappear. Communities without written names, but not without histories. A home in Doggerland may leave almost nothing behind. A shelter of poles, bark, hide, reeds, and woven plant fibre can stand through a season, keep out wind and rain, hold warmth around a hearth, and then disappear so completely that only a slight stain in the soil remains. On dry land, archaeologists sometimes recover post holes, hearth pits, concentrations of flint, and trampled surfaces that reveal where such structures once stood. Beneath the North Sea, even those faint traces may be eroded, buried deeply, or scattered before they are found. The vanished architecture of Doggerland therefore has to be approached indirectly, through better preserved Mesolithic sites around the North Sea basin and through the logic of the landscape itself. These communities were mobile, but mobility did not mean that every camp was temporary in the same way. Some places may have been used for a night while people followed game or crossed a river system. Others could have served as seasonal bases returned to repeatedly over many years. A dry ridge above wetlands, close to fresh water and several habitats, would have offered advantages difficult to ignore. From such a place, people could reach fishing grounds, woodland, marsh, and open grazing areas without moving the entire camp. Repeated return might create a layered history of fires, broken tools, discarded bone, and repaired equipment. Shelters were probably adapted to purpose and season. A small hunting camp might need only a windbreak and a carefully placed fire. A longer occupation could justify a more substantial frame of bent poles anchored into the ground, covered with hide, bark, turf, or reeds. Low-rounded structures resist wind better than tall walls, especially on exposed ground near water. In wooded areas, trees themselves provide shelter and material. In marshland, raised platforms or dry flooring may have been necessary, though direct evidence from Doggerland remains scarce. Elsewhere in Mesolithic northern Europe, remarkable waterlogged sites preserve wooden structures, worked timbers, reed materials, and carefully arranged activity areas that would normally decay. At Storegga in northern England, people lived beside an ancient lake and built timber platforms or trackways along wet ground, while working antler, bone, wood, and flint with considerable skill. It would be misleading to treat Storegga as a complete model for Doggerland, but it demonstrates what northern hunter-gatherers of this broad period were capable of creating. Their camps were not accidental piles of possessions. They could be organized landscapes of work, movement, storage, repair, and return. The hearth often formed the practical center. Fire-dried clothing and hides, discouraged insects, provided light, softened materials, cooked food, and made cold, damp evenings bearable. Its position mattered, too exposed, and wind scattered sparks and heat, too enclosed, and smoke became a problem. Fuel also had to be gathered continually. Fallen branches, driftwood, peat, bark, and different species of wood burned in different ways. Knowledge of fuel was another quiet technology, rarely celebrated because it left so little behind. Cooking transformed the range of usable food. Meat could be roasted, boiled, smoked, or dried. Fish could be cooked immediately or preserved for later. Heated stones may have been placed in skin, bark, or wooden containers to boil water before widespread pottery. A method known from many societies, though difficult to prove at any individual Doggerland camp. Roasting pits and earth ovens could cook food slowly beneath covered embers. Fat, marrow, organs, plants, nuts, shellfish. and fish together created a diet far more varied than the simple image of hunters eating only large game. Hazelnuts may have been especially important in woodland zones. At some Mesolithic sites elsewhere in Britain, large quantities of charred nutshells suggest organised collection and roasting. Roasting improves flavour, reduces moisture, and helps delay spoilage. A concentrated seasonal harvest could supply valuable calories during colder months or while travelling. Yet plant foods rarely preserve as clearly as bone, so the balance of diet remains difficult to calculate. What survives in the record almost certainly understates the daily labour of gathering roots, greens, berries, fungi, seeds, and nuts. Fishing required its own knowledge and equipment. Rivers, lakes, tidal creeks, and estuaries offered many opportunities, but fish behaviour changes with season, temperature, and water level. Barbed points could be used in shallow water. Nets made from plant fibre might catch many small fish at once. Basket traps and weirs could guide fish into enclosed spaces as tides or river currents changed. Wooden stakes, cordage, and woven materials would decay quickly unless preserved in waterlogged conditions, leaving little trace beneath the later sea. The absence of traps in the archaeological record does not prove their absence from daily life. Hunting was equally varied. Large animals could provide enormous returns, but they were dangerous and costly to pursue. Deer, boar, aurochs, elk, waterfowl, and smaller game required different weapons and strategies. Bows and arrows offered speed and distance in woodland. Spears and thrusting weapons remained useful at close range or in organised drives. Hunters may have used natural bottlenecks, river crossings, marsh edges, and animal paths to increase their chances. Knowledge of migration and breeding cycles allowed people to predict where animals would appear, while tracks, droppings, hair, disturbed plants, and calls provided immediate information. Success created more work. A large animal had to be butchered before meat spoiled or scavengers arrived. Hides needed scraping, stretching, and drying. Sinew could become binding material. Bone and antler supplied points, wedges, needles, handles, and ornaments. Fat could be rendered and used in food, lighting, or hide treatment. Very little was necessarily wasted, though the exact practices varied between communities. A kill site might therefore become a temporary workshop, while selected portions were carried back to camp. The making and repair of tools filled quieter hours. Flint edges dulled quickly and needed resharpening. Microliths broke and had to be replaced in composite shafts. Adhesives made from tree resin, tar, wax, or mixtures of organic material required preparation and careful heating. Cordage could be twisted from plant fibres, bark strips, sinew, or animal gut. Baskets, mats, nets, bags, and clothing demanded long hours of repetitive work. Because these materials rarely survive, the Stone Age is named after the most durable fraction of its technology, rather than the materials people probably handled most often. Clothing had to respond to cold, rain, insects, and constant contact with wet vegetation. Hides could be scraped, softened, smoked, and sewn into layered garments. Fur retained warmth, while lighter skins offered flexibility. Footwear was essential across marshes, woodland floors, frozen ground, and sharp gravel. Mesolithic shoes survive only in exceptional conditions elsewhere, but earlier and later prehistoric examples show that simple leather footwear could be carefully constructed. Clothing was not merely protection. Differences in cut, decoration, material, or ornament may have communicated identity, skill, age, or affiliation. though scholars still debate how much can be inferred from the scattered evidence. Daily life followed light and season more than the abstract measurement of hours. Dawn brought changes in bird calls, wind, and visibility. Tides shaped coastal work. Weather determined whether people travelled, repaired tools, gathered fuel, or remained close to shelter. Autumn might bring nut collection and deer activity. Spring brought migratory birds, new plant growth, and shifting fish runs. Winter narrowed the available resources but also opened certain routes across firmer ground. There was no single Mesolithic schedule because Doggerland itself contained too many environments and lasted too many thousands of years. The camp was also a social space. Skills had to be demonstrated, observed, corrected, and remembered. Routes, dangerous crossings, animal behaviour, and seasonal changes were shared through practice and oral tradition. Objects could carry histories beyond their immediate use. A well-made point might be repaired repeatedly. A rare piece of stone could travel far from its source. Certain places might become important because people gathered there, not because the soil was uniquely rich. Mobility allowed communities to follow abundance, but it also tied them to networks of familiar places. A seasonal circuit could include river camps, woodland gathering grounds, wetland fishing stations, and coastal sites. The same route might be adjusted as sea level rose or a channel shifted. A home was therefore not only a shelter, it was a sequence of places connected by memory. This way of living required flexibility, but not rootlessness. People could be deeply attached to a landscape without remaining in one settlement year-round. They knew where wood dried best, where birds gathered, where the river could be crossed, and where higher ground remained safe after heavy rain. Doggerland's inhabitants built lightly because movement was part of survival, yet the world around them was anything but temporary in their minds. Camps were remade, paths were retraced, and familiar places gathered meaning through repetition. Almost all of that domestic world has vanished. The woven walls, wooden bowls, sleeping mats, baskets, ropes, clothing, and voices are gone. What remains is a durable scatter beneath marine sediment, yet behind every flint chip lies an act performed beside a fire. Every barbed point belongs to a hand that shaped it, and every camp stood within a wider pattern of movement. Doggerland was inhabited not only through dramatic hunts and long migrations, but through ordinary routines repeated so often that they made the vanished landscape home. Mobility across Doggerland was not simply movement from one side of Europe to another. It was movement through a landscape that offered its own routes, delays, landmarks, and choices. Rivers guided travel, ridges kept feet above wet ground. Coastlines opened access to marine resources, and seasonal changes altered which paths were practical. Flooded channels, dense woodland, boggy basins, and shifting estuaries could turn a direct line into a long detour. Yet for people who knew the country, Doggerland linked regions that later maps make appear permanently separate. Britain's eastern lowlands opened into this wider world. There was no need to cross a sea to move toward the Low Countries or the plains farther east. A group leaving what is now East Anglia could follow river valleys into the southern basin, stop at familiar wetlands, and continue toward continental Europe. Others may have moved northward along higher ground toward areas connected with present-day Denmark or the southern approaches to Scandinavia. The distances were considerable, but the journey could be broken into known stages where water, food, and shelter were available. The rivers were both roads and obstacles. Their banks offered open corridors through woodland, and their courses provided reliable orientation. Where channels were shallow, People crossed on foot, where water was deeper, rafts, skincraft, or dugout canoes may have been used, although direct evidence from Doggerland is rare. Mesolithic communities elsewhere in Europe possessed watercraft and paddles, making some form of river travel highly plausible. A canoe moving downstream could carry people, tools, meat, hides, and gathered food more efficiently than a party on foot through wet ground. Coastal movement became increasingly important as the sea advanced. New estuaries and islands did not necessarily isolate communities immediately. They may have encouraged more frequent use of boats and created productive routes along sheltered water. A shoreline could function as a chain of the resource zones offering fish, shellfish, birds, driftwood, and places to camp. People accustomed to wetlands and rivers would not have regarded every stretch of water as a barrier. The gradual flooding of Doggerland changed the form of connection long before it ended connection altogether. The movement of stone provides one clue to the scale of these networks. Flint is abundant in some regions and scarce in others, while distinctive raw materials can sometimes be traced to particular geological sources. When stone appears far from where it naturally occurs, it suggests direct travel or exchange between groups. A tool may pass through several hands before reaching its final place of use. This does not prove organized trade in the later economic sense, but it does show that communities were not confined to small, isolated territories. Tool styles offer another clue. Similar forms of microliths, blades, and antler points appear across broad areas, though the patterns change through time. Shared designs may reflect related traditions, contact, or the spread of practical ideas between communities facing similar environments. Differences matter too. A change in point shape or blade production may mark a cultural boundary, a new population movement, or simply local preference. Scholars still debate how closely artifact styles correspond to distinct social groups, but the distribution of technology reveals a connected northern world. Doggerland stands near the centre of that world. To the west lie the river valleys and uplands of Britain. To the southeast, the Low Countries open toward the Rhine basin and the interior of Europe. To the northeast, routes lead toward the lands bordering the Baltic and southern Scandinavia. The region is therefore not merely a bridge between two endpoints. It is a crossroads where routes intersect, resources concentrate, and communities may meet. Meetings could occur for many reasons. Several groups might gather where fish runs were predictable, where large herds crossed a river, or where hazelnuts could be collected in abundance. Seasonal aggregation would allow people to exchange partners, tools, stories, and information about distant conditions. It could renew alliances and reduce the risks of living in small mobile groups. During the rest of the year, communities might separate again into smaller units better suited to local resources. These networks carried knowledge as well as objects. News of a flooded route, a productive hunting ground, or a newly formed channel could spread from one group to another. Techniques for making traps, preparing hides, shaping antler, or navigating tidal water might move across the landscape without leaving an obvious archaeological signature. Songs, rituals, and names for places could travel even farther, although none survive in a form that can be recognized. Human movement was also tied to animal movement. Hunters followed deer between woodland and open ground, watched birds along migration routes, and learned the seasonal behavior of fish. Some journeys may have been planned around these cycles. Mobility was not a single annual migration, but a flexible pattern of short and long movements layered across the year. The people themselves did not remain genetically or culturally unchanged. Ancient DNA from Britain and continental Europe shows that hunter-gatherer populations shifted, mixed, and sometimes replaced one another during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. Doggerland almost certainly formed one of the main zones through which these movements occurred. Yet the lack of securely identified human remains from the drowned landscape prevents a precise account of who moved where at every stage. What survives in the broader record suggests repeated connections rather than one simple wave of settlement. Britain's later insularity should not be projected backward. For much of the period, people living in Britain were part of the same connected ecological and social sphere as communities across the basin. Similar animals moved through the same environment, raw materials, tool traditions, and perhaps kinship ties crossed what would later become open water. Britain was a western region of a continental landscape, not an island standing apart. As sea level rose, that reality began to change unevenly. Some routes disappeared while others shifted onto higher ground. A familiar river crossing might become tidal. A low ridge connecting two territories could narrow into a causeway and then vanish beneath water. Communities adapted by changing camps, using boats more often, or travelling around newly flooded basins. The cost of movement increased, but connection did not end in a single moment. This gradual change may have altered social geography before physical separation became complete. Groups once able to meet frequently might gather less often. Exchange networks might contract or reorganize along new coastal routes. A journey that once took several days on foot could require a risky water crossing. The landscape was not only losing area, it was changing the relationships between the people who depended on it. Yet rising water may also have created new hubs. Estuaries concentrate fish, birds, shellfish, and driftwood. Islands can become strategic stopping points. Some communities may have remained in shrinking parts of Doggerland because the new coastal environments were productive. The idea that people simply fled inland as soon as water appeared is too simple. Adaptation could make the final landscapes attractive even as they became more vulnerable. Movement across Doggerland carried food, tools, raw materials, knowledge, ancestry, and memory. It linked communities across a region that modern geography has split into separate nations. When the sea finally widened, it did more than cover land. It severed paths that had once connected human worlds. The old routes did not vanish from history entirely. Their traces remain in shared technologies, genetic relationships, and submerged valleys beneath the North Sea. What had been a corridor of footsteps, canoes, camps, and seasonal gatherings became a marine boundary. Doggerland's disappearance did not merely remove a landscape, it rewrote the map of human connection in northwestern Europe. The North Sea does not give up Doggerland in complete scenes. It offers fragments dragged from darkness, often far from the places where they were first dropped, broken, buried, or lost. A fisherman empties a net and finds a mammoth tooth among the catch. A dredging vessel lifts sand that contains a worked flint. A lump of peat washes onto a beach, carrying pollen from a vanished marsh. An antler point appears from water, deep enough to hide the landscape that once supported the animal, the hunter, and the toolmaker. Each object is small compared with the lost country, but together they turn the seabed into one of the largest archaeological sites in Europe. The famous barbed antler point recovered by the trawler Calinda remains one of the clearest examples. It was raised from the North Sea in 1931 from an area east of Norfolk, though the exact original layer and location could not be preserved by the fishing process. The point was carefully shaped, with barbs cut along one edge, and probably belonged to a composite hunting or fishing weapon. Its design resembles Mesolithic objects from dryland sites around northern Europe. The tool does not reveal who made it, what animal it was used against, or whether it was lost accidentally, discarded, or carried away by later currents. Yet its existence in the middle of the modern sea demonstrates something more direct than any map a person once stood on land where ships now pass. Other barbed points have been recovered from the southern North Sea, especially from zones affected by fishing, dredging, and sand extraction. Many are made from red deer antler or bone. Their forms vary, suggesting different functions or traditions. Some may have been used as fishing spears or harpoons. Others may have belonged to hunting weapons aimed at larger animals. The exact distinction is difficult because these artifacts are usually found without shafts, bindings, or preserved organic residues. Even so, their manufacture required experience. Antler had to be obtained, split, shaped, scraped, polished, and cut without weakening the finished point. The finished object was only one part of a more complex tool that has otherwise disappeared. Flint artifacts are more numerous but often less visually dramatic. A single flake may look like an ordinary sharp stone, yet its fracture pattern can preserve the sequence of human action, the angle of impact, the bulb created by a strike, and the scars from earlier removals reveal intentional manufacture. Cores show how blades were taken from selected pieces of raw material. Retouched edges indicate tools modified for cutting, scraping, piercing, or use in composite weapons. Microliths, small carefully shaped pieces, may once have been fitted into wooden or bone shafts with adhesive and binding. The seabed complicates interpretation. Stones are moved by currents, storms, ice, trawling, and dredging. A flint recovered from a load of aggregate may have travelled from the extraction site to a coastal deposit before being noticed. Its broad region of origin may be known, while its exact archaeological context is lost. This means researchers must resist the temptation to treat every isolated artifact as evidence of a settlement directly beneath the discovery point. One worked flint proves human activity somewhere within the sediment history. A cluster of artifacts associated with a buried riverbank or preserved land surface offers much stronger evidence. Some of the richest concentrations have been linked to areas such as Brown Bank, where shallow topography, buried channels, and repeated discoveries suggest former habitable ground. Fishing crews and dredging operations have recovered antler tools, flint, animal bone, and peat from nearby zones. Archaeological surveys attempt to relocate the source deposits by combining find records with seismic maps and sediment cores. The task resembles reconstructing a shattered object after most pieces have been scattered and several have been carried away. Animal remains form another enormous part of the archive. Mammoth teeth and tusk fragments are among the most recognizable, but they belong mainly to colder Pleistocene environments that predate the greener Mesolithic world. Woolly rhinoceros, reindeer, horse, bison, aurochs, red deer, elk, wild boar, and other species appear in different sediments and periods. Their bones help reveal how the ecosystem changed as climate warmed and open. Steppe gave way to woodland and wetland. A bone does not automatically prove human contact. Animals die naturally. Rivers move carcasses and predators scatter remains. Archaeologists look for cut marks, percussion damage, burning, polish, shaping, or unusual breakage. A long bone split to remove marrow tells a different story from one rolled naturally in a river channel. An antler beam with repeated tool marks records deliberate working. Even then, marine abrasion can alter surfaces and create misleading marks, so microscopic analysis is often necessary. Occasionally, artifacts preserve stories more complicated than simple use. A decorated or unusually shaped object may have carried symbolic value. A tool repaired several times may have been kept beyond its easiest period of use. A piece made from non-local stone may reveal movement or exchange. Without context, these possibilities remain cautious interpretations rather than facts. But they remind researchers that the people of Doggerland did not relate to objects only through immediate utility. Peat is less striking in a museum case, yet scientifically it can be more informative than a spear point. Peat forms slowly in waterlogged places where dead plants do not fully decay. Layers can trap pollen, seeds, wood fragments, insects, charcoal, microscopic organisms, and chemical traces. A peat block recovered from the North Sea may therefore preserve a compressed section of marsh or bog that existed before the sea arrived. The transition within a core can be remarkably clear. At the bottom may lie river sand or a soil surface formed on dry land. Above it, freshwater peat records a marsh or bog. Higher still, changes in microscopic organisms and chemistry show increasing salinity. The peat gives way to estuarine mud, then marine sediment. The sequence records not a sudden universal flood, but a local environmental transformation. Dry ground becomes wetland, fresh water becomes brackish, and brackish water becomes sea. Pollen once provided the main biological evidence from these deposits. Each grain is tiny, durable, and often distinctive enough to identify a plant family or genus. A shift from grasses and cold-adapted shrubs toward birch, pine, hazel, elm, and oak reveals ecological change. Yet pollen can travel long distances on wind or water, which sometimes makes it difficult to determine whether a plant grew directly beside the sampling site. Sedimentary ancient DNA adds another layer. Genetic fragments shed by roots, leaves, pollen, animals, and microorganisms can survive within sediment under favourable conditions. The 2026 study of hundreds of samples from dozens of marine cores used these traces to reconstruct parts of Doggerland's ecology with far greater detail. The results suggest that southern areas supported habitable forests earlier than previously thought, including oak, elm, and hazel communities from around 16,000 years ago in some locations. This does not mean every part of Doggerland was densely forested at that time. The region was vast, climates fluctuated, and different habitats existed side by side. DNA can also be transported or preserved unevenly. Researchers must compare genetic signals with pollen, sediment type, dating, and landscape position. Still, the evidence strengthens the view that Doggerland included long-lived ecological refuges where plants, animals, and perhaps human groups found favourable conditions during periods once imagined as too cold or unstable. Other discoveries are more accidental. Ancient wood can appear in dredged sediment, sometimes bearing possible tool marks. Shells and fish remains help reconstruct aquatic habitats. Charcoal may record fire, though separating human burning from natural events is difficult. Bones recovered by beachcombers after nourishment projects can originate from offshore sand deposits excavated many kilometres away. Modern engineering has therefore become an unwilling archaeological force, exposing evidence while simultaneously destroying or displacing its context. This creates a race between discovery and loss. Offshore wind farms, pipelines, communication cables, aggregate extraction, bottom trawling, and coastal defence projects all disturb the seabed. Some development now includes archaeological assessment, allowing buried channels and sensitive areas to be mapped before construction. Yet the scale of the North Sea is immense, and only a fraction has been investigated directly. Citizen collectors and fishing communities remain important because they encounter material that professional archaeologists might never see. Their records can identify productive zones and save rare artifacts from disposal. At the same time, finds without exact coordinates or sediment information lose much of their scientific value. A mammoth tooth on a shelf proves less than a tooth tied to a dated layer within a mapped river valley. The clues raised from the sea are therefore both precious and frustrating. They prove that the submerged landscape was occupied, hunted, worked, crossed, and remembered. They reveal forests, wetlands, animals, tools, and human skill. Yet each object arrives damaged by distance from its original setting. The sea preserves and erases at the same time. A barbed point can return after 8,000 years, but not the hand that held it. A flint blade can keep its sharp edge, but not the wooden handle or the purpose of its final journey. A peat core can restore a forest, but not the names people gave its trees. Doggerland survives through these partial returns, rising piece by piece from the seabed, never whole, but no longer invisible. The map of Doggerland is not found in one place. It has to be assembled from sound, mud, pollen, chemistry, ancient genetic fragments, and mathematical models, each revealing a different layer of the vanished terrain. No technique restores the landscape perfectly. A seismic survey can trace a buried river, but cannot show the people walking beside it. A sediment core can preserve thousands of years of environmental change within a narrow cylinder. Yet it samples only one point in a region once larger than many modern countries. The reconstruction becomes convincing only when independent forms of evidence begin to agree. The first challenge is to see beneath the modern seabed. Sand and marine mud cover much of the ancient surface, sometimes by only a few meters and sometimes far more deeply. Ordinary maps show the shape of the seafloor as it exists now, but the surface used by Mesolithic communities may lie buried beneath later deposits. Researchers therefore use seismic reflection, sending acoustic pulses downward and recording the echoes that return from boundaries between different sediment layers. The principle resembles an echo in a dark chamber. Sound travels through water and seabed material, reflecting differently from sand, peat, clay, gravel, and older geological formations. The timing and strength of the returning signals allow scientists to construct cross-sections beneath the sea floor. Repeated survey lines can reveal channels, ridges, basins, terraces, and erosion surfaces. What appears from above as an undistinguished stretch of sea may conceal the outline of a broad valley filled with younger sediment. Much of this data was originally collected by the offshore energy industry. Oil and gas companies surveyed enormous areas of the North Sea to understand deep geology and plan infrastructure. Archaeologists later recognized that the shallower layers contained another resource: the buried geography of human prehistory. Information gathered for industrial purposes could be reprocessed to identify ancient river systems and potential land surfaces. This unusual partnership means that parts of Doggerland are known through data never intended to recover them. Bathymetry adds the shape of the present seabed. Sonar measurements record depth across large areas, revealing banks, channels, slopes, and depressions. Some modern features correspond loosely to remnants of older topography, while others result from marine erosion and sediment movement after inundation. Doggerland, for example, preserves a broad, shallow region that remained above water longer than many surrounding lowlands. But its modern outline is not identical to the last dry land. Waves, tides, and currents have altered it for thousands of years. To reconstruct an ancient surface, researchers must separate what belonged to the old landscape from what the sea created afterward. They combine bathymetric data with seismic layers, boreholes, sediment cores, and geological models. The result is a paleodigital elevation model, a computer reconstruction of land height at a chosen moment in the past. Once approximate elevations are established, sea level estimates can be applied to show where coastlines, estuaries, lakes, and islands may have existed. The apparent simplicity of flooding a digital map hides major uncertainty. The land itself has moved since the Ice Age. The weight of enormous ice sheets depressed parts of northern Europe, while the crust farther south responded in a different way. When the ice melted, the ground began a slow adjustment that continues today. Some regions rose while others sank relative to the ocean. Sediments also compact over time, especially peat and soft mud, reducing their modern elevation. Researchers must account for these movements before deciding how high an ancient shoreline stood. Tides present another complication. A model showing average sea level does not capture the full reach of water during storms, spring tides, or river floods. Low coastal terrain may have remained technically above mean sea level while being regularly submerged or too waterlogged for sustained use. A thin strip of mapped land might in practice have been salt marsh, mudflat, or a chain of temporary islands. The difference between dry ground and habitable ground is therefore crucial. Sediment cores provide direct evidence against which the models can be tested. A core barrel pushed into the seabed retrieves a column of material whose lowest layers are usually the oldest. In favourable locations, it may pass from marine sand into estuarine silt, then through freshwater peat and into an ancient soil or river deposit. Each transition records a change in local conditions. If a model predicts open sea at a time when the core contains freshwater peat, the reconstruction needs revision. Dating these transitions is essential. Radiocarbon analysis measures the remaining carbon-14 in organic material such as plant fragments, peat, shell, or bone. The result is not a perfect calendar date but a probability range that must be calibrated using known variations in atmospheric carbon through time. Marine samples introduce additional problems because carbon circulates differently in the ocean. Material may also have been redeposited from an older layer into a younger one. For this reason, the strongest chronological sequences rely on multiple dates from carefully interpreted deposits rather than one isolated sample. Pollen grains restore vegetation at a microscopic scale. Their outer walls can survive long after the parent plants disappear. Different trees and herbs produce distinctive pollen, allowing specialists to track the spread of birch, pine, hazel, elm, oak, grasses, and wetland species. A rise in hazel pollen may mark woodland expansion. Increasing salt-tolerant plants may reveal the approach of brackish water. The sudden appearance of marine organisms in a formerly freshwater sequence can signal inundation. Yet pollen is carried by wind and water. A tree growing many kilometers away may contribute grains to a lake or marsh, while a nearby insect-pollinated plant may leave only a weak signal. Pollen data are therefore interpreted as regional evidence rather than a perfect inventory of everything growing beside the core. Seeds, wood fragments, insect remains, and microscopic algae can sharpen the local picture. Sedimentary ancient DNA reaches further into the hidden ecosystem. Living organisms constantly shed genetic material through cells, roots, leaves, waste, and decay. Some fragments become trapped in mud or peat and survive for thousands of years, especially in cold, waterlogged, low-oxygen conditions. In the laboratory, scientists extract these fragments, sequence them, and compare them with modern genetic databases to identify the organisms that left them. The method is extraordinarily sensitive, which is both its strength and its danger. Modern contamination can enter during drilling, handling, transport, or laboratory work. DNA may move through sediments with groundwater or attached to mineral particles. Some species are easier to detect than others because they shed more material or are better represented in reference databases. Researchers use clean procedures, control samples, replication, and comparison with pollen and sedimentology to reduce these risks. The 2026 study of southern Doggerland applied sedimentary DNA analysis across 252 samples from 41 marine cores. Rather than relying on one spectacular specimen, it examined patterns across many locations and layers. The results indicated that parts of the submerged region supported woodland communities, including oak, elm, and hazel, from approximately 16,000 years ago. This suggests that ecologically favourable zones may have existed earlier than older broad-scale models implied. The finding does not produce a photograph of a continuous forest or prove that people occupied every wooded area. It reveals biological presence within sampled environments. Archaeologists must still ask whether those locations offered fresh water, dry ground, animal resources, and access routes suitable for human settlement. Even so, the evidence changes the probabilities. A landscape once imagined mainly as cold transit ground now contains potential refuges and resource-rich habitats in which communities could remain. Computer models bring these separate observations together. Researchers can simulate sea level rise across reconstructed terrain, estimate the growth of estuaries, and calculate how much land disappears during particular intervals. Dates from archaeological sites can be plotted against changing coastlines to explore how human settlement responds. Some models suggest major losses of habitable area around 10,500 to 10,000 years before the present, perhaps earlier in certain low-lying zones than older maps proposed. These simulations are not time machines. Their apparent precision can exceed the certainty of the underlying data. A coastline drawn as a sharp line on a screen may represent a broad zone of marsh, tidal channels, and seasonal flooding. A missing core can conceal a ridge or valley that changes the local picture. Different assumptions about land movement, sea level, and erosion produce different maps. Scholars still debate the exact size and outline of Doggerland at many stages. The goal is therefore not to create one final map and declare the mystery solved. It is to build a sequence of increasingly plausible landscapes. One reconstruction may show the broad plain of the late Ice Age. Another reveals rivers and woodlands spreading during warmer centuries. Later maps show marine water entering valleys, wetlands expanding, and dry ground breaking into peninsulas. Still later, isolated islands remain above a widening sea. Artificial intelligence and automated pattern recognition are beginning to help researchers search the immense volume of offshore data. Projects such as Subnautica combine seismic archives, geological information, environmental records, and predictive models to identify areas where prehistoric surfaces or human activity may be preserved. Algorithms can flag buried channels, terraces, and anomalies for closer investigation, but they do not replace excavation or interpretation. A promising shape in seismic data may prove to be geological rather than archaeological. The seafloor remains too vast to examine uniformly. Researchers must choose where to core, survey, or sample, often guided by models that are themselves incomplete. This creates a circular challenge. Evidence improves the maps, while the maps determine where new evidence is sought. Each successful core narrows uncertainty, but each also reveals more complexity. What emerges is not a recovered country with every river named and settlement located. It is a layered scientific reconstruction, strongest where sound, sediment, dates, pollen, DNA, and artifacts converge. Doggerland returns through agreement among traces that were never meant to survive together. A buried valley appears first as an acoustic reflection. A core then reveals freshwater peat within it. Pollen restores hazel and oak. Ancient DNA confirms a broader woodland community. Radiocarbon dating places the wetland before marine inundation. A worked flint from nearby adds the possibility of human presence. None of these clues is complete alone. Together, they allow the drowned landscape to rise again, not as legend, but as an evidence-based world whose outlines become clearer with every layer drawn from beneath the sea. The first losses are easy to miss. A meadow remains usable, but only in drier months. A familiar path crosses shallow water after storms. Freshwater reeds begin to share the marsh with plants that tolerate salt. Fish appear farther inland than before. The changes arrive through rivers, tides, and saturated ground rather than through one advancing wall of sea. For people living within Doggerland, the end begins as a sequence of local adjustments. Global sea level rises because the great ice sheets are melting, returning water to the oceans after thousands of years of glacial storage. Yet Doggerland does not respond as a rigid platform being lowered into a still basin. Its land surface is uneven, its sediments compact, its rivers shift, and the crust beneath northern Europe continues to adjust after the removal of ice. Water reaches some valleys early, while nearby ridges remain dry for centuries. The result is a complicated retreat in which the coastline curves inland, breaks apart, and reforms again. The southern lowlands are especially vulnerable. Much of the region lies only slightly above sea level, so a modest vertical rise can flood a wide horizontal area. A few millimeters each year seems almost insignificant, but over generations the accumulated change becomes profound. Recent reconstructions indicate periods of particularly rapid rise during the early Holocene, including accelerations around 10,300 and 8,300 years ago. During some phases, average rates may have approached 8 or 9 millimeters in a year. Across a century, that can mean nearly a meter of additional water before tides, storms, erosion, or land subsidence are considered. The impact is not measured only in square kilometers lost. It is measured in the changing usefulness of what remains. Low ground may turn into marsh long before it disappears beneath open water. Soil becomes saturated. Trees die where roots can no longer tolerate prolonged flooding. Freshwater pools become brackish. Mosquitoes, insects, and water birds increase in some areas while grazing animals abandon others. A camp that remains technically above sea level may no longer be comfortable, safe, or close to dependable drinking water. At first, the new wetlands can be rich. Tidal creeks carry fish inland. Mudflats attract birds. Salt marsh provides seasonal grazing for animals. Shellfish become available where none existed before. People familiar with rivers and marshes can adapt quickly. and the expanding coast may offer more food than the inland forest. This is one reason Doggerland's inhabitants may not have responded to every new inlet by retreating immediately. Rising water creates opportunity even as it removes land. The balance shifts when access becomes more difficult. A broad floodplain may once have connected several river valleys, allowing people to move between them on foot. As water spreads, the same area becomes a network of creeks, pools, and unstable peat. Travel slows. Heavy loads become harder to carry. Crossing points change with the tide. A journey remembered as direct becomes a long route around the head of an estuary, or a passage by boat. The exact sequence differs from place to place. In some parts of southern Doggerland, models suggest large losses of land around 10,500 to 10,000 years before the present, perhaps earlier than an older reconstructions allowed. Elsewhere, higher terrain persists. The coastline may retreat rapidly for several generations, then appear relatively stable while people adjust to the new boundary. Stability is temporary. Another acceleration in sea level, a change in a river drainage, or a series of storms can begin the process again. Rivers deepen and widen near their mouths. Tidal influence reaches farther inland. Freshwater channels reverse briefly with the tide, carrying salt into former marshes. Estuaries open where valleys once held settlements, hunting routes, or gathering places. On their edges, erosion cuts into peat and soil, removing archaeological traces before marine sediment can protect them. The record of human occupation is therefore lost unevenly. Some sites are buried and preserved, others are dismantled by waves and currents until nothing remains in its original position. Woodland retreats from the wettest ground. Dead trees may stand for years in drowned forests, their trunks rising from shallow water before decay and storms bring them down. Similar submerged forests appear today along parts of the North Sea coast, when tides strip sand from ancient surfaces. They offer a small visual echo of what the advancing shoreline may have looked like: dark stumps, rooted in peat, exposed where dry land once extended. For communities watching this transformation, the sea is not an abstract measurement. It changes where people sleep, where animals cross, and where food can be found. A stand of hazel may fail after repeated saltwater flooding. A freshwater spring becomes unreliable. A route used in winter is cut by a tidal creek. Familiar places do not vanish all at once. They become less dependable. That distinction matters because memory can outlast geography. People may continue returning to a favoured camp after the surrounding terrain begins to deteriorate. A place can remain socially important even when it is no longer the most practical location. Hearths may be rebuilt farther upslope. Activities shift onto nearby ridges. The old lower ground remains visible, perhaps marked by dying trees or the outline of former paths beneath shallow water. As the coast moves inward, Doggerland becomes more maritime. Boats, rafts, or other watercraft likely grow more important, though the submerged record preserves little direct evidence. Water crossings that were once optional become necessary. Fishing and tidal knowledge gain value. Communities may become more skilled at reading currents, winds, and changing channels. Adaptation is not surrender. It is an active reorganization of life around the new geography. Yet water also fragments social space. A low ridge that once connected two territories becomes a narrow neck of land. High tides cut across it. Eventually, it remains dry only during certain seasons. When the channel becomes permanent, a peninsula turns into an island. People on either side can still meet, but the journey now depends on weather, boats, and confidence on the water. This fragmentation occurs repeatedly. Broad plains break into smaller blocks, estuaries isolate uplands, wetlands occupy the lower interiors. Some surviving areas become long, narrow peninsulas vulnerable to flooding from both sides. Others persist as islands surrounded by productive but dangerous tidal water. Doggerbank may have formed one of the most substantial late remnants, though its precise size and habitability change through time. Maps often show these stages as clean outlines land in one colour, sea in another. The lived reality would have been far less orderly. Between dry ground and open sea lay broad transitional zones of marsh, reed beds, mudflat, sandbar, shallow lagoon, and seasonally flooded meadow. A place might be crossed in winter when water was low and avoided in spring. Storm tides could briefly surround ground that appeared connected during calmer periods. The coastline was not a line. It was an unstable region. Some people may have moved inland before conditions became severe, following kin networks or established routes toward Britain and continental Europe. Others may have remained because coastal resources were abundant, because familiar places held meaning, or because nearby higher ground still seemed secure. There would have been no single decision made by all communities. Doggerland was too large, its flooding too uneven, and its human population too varied for one uniform response. The evidence cannot reveal how each departure occurred. A camp abandoned after repeated flooding may look much like one left for seasonal reasons. Tools can be carried away, leaving little trace. A family moving to higher ground does not create an archaeological marker labelled migration. Researchers therefore reconstruct population change indirectly through settlement patterns, artifact distributions, environmental shifts, and evidence from the lands surrounding the submerged basin. What can be seen clearly is the narrowing of possibility. Each flooded valley removes one route. Each widening estuary separates another area. Each season of saltwater intrusion changes the plants and animals that once made a place reliable. The people of Doggerland remain capable, observant, and adaptable, but they cannot stop the physical process reshaping their world. By the later stages, the country is no longer one continuous expanse. It has become a broken landscape of marshes, islands, peninsulas, and shrinking uplands. The old interior is turning into coast. The sea now lies not only beyond the horizon but inside the roots, camps, and river basins that once held the region together. There is still land. There are still places worth inhabiting. Fires may still burn on high ground, and boats may still cross channels where people once walked, but the scale has changed. Doggerland is no longer expanding into a warmer world. It is contracting within one, and every generation inherits a smaller map. The people living through Doggerland's decline did not experience it as a single event with a clear beginning and an approaching end. They inherited a landscape already changing, adapted to conditions that seemed normal within their own lifetimes, and passed on a slightly altered world to those who followed. A shoreline moving inland by small increments can remain almost invisible from one year to the next, across several generations. However, the accumulated difference becomes enormous. This creates one of the deepest problems in reconstructing the human side of Doggerland. The geological record reveals long-term trends. Maps can show thousands of square kilometers disappearing between one date and another. Sea level curves compress centuries into a rising line. Human memory does not work at that scale. A person measures change through familiar paths, seasonal camps, old stories, and comparisons with the places remembered by older relatives. A low meadow may flood more often than it once did. A crossing may become dangerous except during the calmest months. A stand of trees may die after repeated saltwater intrusion. These changes are significant, but each can be explained locally. A storm was unusually strong. A river changed course. The ground has always been wet in spring. The sea has come close before and then withdrawn. Without instruments, written records, or a concept of global sea level rise, there is no obvious reason to conclude that the entire country is moving toward permanent inundation. People would still have recognized environmental change with great precision. Their survival depended on noticing small differences in water, vegetation, animal behavior, and weather. They could identify when fish entered a channel earlier than expected, when birds abandoned a wetland, or when grazing animals stopped using a floodplain. They may have remembered that certain trees once grew farther downslope, or that a route had been passable during an earlier season. Practical awareness does not necessarily produce a prediction of total disappearance. Oral tradition could preserve memories beyond a single lifetime. Stories may have recalled old camps swallowed by water, islands that had once been connected to the mainland, or ancestors who crossed ground now reached only by boat. Many societies maintain detailed accounts of landscape change, storms, migration, and unusual natural events. It is possible that Doggerland's communities developed narratives explaining the advancing sea. The evidence remains incomplete because words leave no archaeological layer, but there is no reason to assume that repeated losses passed without cultural meaning. Those stories may not have framed the change as a process with an inevitable final stage. A flooded place could be understood as dangerous, transformed, sacred, abandoned, or claimed by forces within the natural world. The modern scientific explanation of melting ice sheets and global ocean volume would have been unavailable, but communities could still construct explanations grounded in experience. Water that repeatedly takes land and becomes part of memory even when its ultimate reach cannot be known. The scale of change also varies across the region. One group may live for decades on relatively stable higher ground, while another loses access to a river basin within a generation. A community in southern Doggerland might face rapid marsh expansion, while people farther north continue using broad areas that remain dry. There is therefore no single moment when all inhabitants recognize the same danger. The country is disappearing unevenly, and information about distant conditions may travel slowly through social networks. Movement offers a practical response. If one camp becomes unreliable, another can be established farther inland or on higher ground. If a crossing fails, a new route can be learned. Mobile communities are not tied to permanent buildings, fields, or large stores that must be defended in place. This flexibility may reduce the immediate pressure created by environmental loss. A settlement does not need to be protected behind walls when shelters can be rebuilt elsewhere. Yet mobility can conceal the seriousness of the larger trend. Each local adjustment succeeds. People avoid the flooded meadow, use a different bank, move the seasonal camp, and continue. The strategy works until the number of alternatives begins to shrink. A new route may require more time. Higher ground may already be used by another group. The remaining dry areas may support fewer animals or provide less fresh water. Adaptation postpones crisis without reversing the process. The social consequences may begin before starvation or forced flight. Groups that once met regularly may find the journey between them more difficult. Seasonal gathering places become inaccessible. Exchange routes weaken. Knowledge tied to particular landscapes loses practical value. A person who knows every channel of a disappearing marsh may hold expertise that becomes less useful after relocation. The loss is cultural as well as physical. Territory may become more contested as habitable ground contracts, though direct evidence for conflict within Doggerland is scarce and should not be assumed. Cooperation may be equally likely. Kinship and exchange networks could help displaced groups join communities elsewhere. Shared access to coastal resources might become more important. People may reorganize their movements to avoid pressure on the same places. No single explanation fully accounts for how different groups responded. The retreating landscape may also change the meaning of ownership and belonging. In a mobile society, attachment does not require permanent occupation. A river bend, burial place, hunting ground, or seasonal camp can belong to the social world of a community because it is revisited, remembered, and connected to ancestors. When rising water removes such places, relocation is not simply a practical move to another patch of ground. It can sever relationships between people, memory, and landscape. Some locations may remain visible beneath shallow water for years. Tree stumps stand where woodland once grew. Paths can perhaps be traced at low tide. Flooded ridges appear as sandbars. People may continue visiting them by boat, fishing over old ground or returning to places that remain significant. A landscape does not cease to matter the moment it becomes difficult to inhabit. Higher ground offers temporary reassurance. As lowlands disappear, surviving ridges and uplands seem safer. Camps shift upward. Islands emerge from what had once been ordinary terrain. The surrounding water may appear productive and manageable. If boats are available and tidal knowledge is strong, isolation does not necessarily mean abandonment. Some of Doggerland's final communities may have lived in environments that were increasingly maritime while still retaining memory of the larger country. This adaptation could produce a dangerous illusion of stability. An island that survives several generations may feel permanent. The sea has already taken the lower ground, but the highest parts remain. People rebuild, fish, hunt, gather fuel, and maintain routes to neighboring lands. The final remnants are smaller, yet they may still support life well enough to encourage continued occupation. Population movement toward Britain or continental Europe would not always look like a dramatic evacuation. Individuals might join relatives elsewhere. Partnerships could carry people across widening channels. Seasonal visits might become permanent residents. A group could gradually spend less time on shrinking islands until the old camp was no longer used. Archaeologically, such a process leaves no single destruction layer and no moment when the last inhabitants announce their departure. Later communities living on the new coasts may have preserved knowledge of the drowned land. From eastern Britain, people could look across water toward places their predecessors had reached on foot, on continental shores. Similar memories may have survived in changed form. This sea becomes a boundary, but it is a recent boundary, laid over roots still present within collective memory. The transformation may therefore have been understood both clearly and incompletely. People knew that particular places were being lost. They may have recognized that water was advancing across generations. They adapted with skill and likely told stories about what was happening. What they could not know was the final shape of the future coast, or that nearly the entire landscape would disappear from human sight. That uncertainty makes their experience unsettlingly familiar. Human beings respond most easily to immediate threats and local changes. Slow processes are absorbed into ordinary life until their cumulative force becomes undeniable. Each generation begins with the world it inherits and treats much of that world as normal. Doggerland's inhabitants were not unaware observers waiting passively for disaster. They moved, learned, remembered, and reorganized their lives. Yet the sea operated on a scale larger than any one community's experience. By the time its direction became unmistakable, much of the old country had already been transformed. What remained was increasingly fragile, divided by water, and exposed to forces capable of turning gradual loss into sudden catastrophe. Far to the north, beyond the shrinking wetlands and islands of Doggerland, an immense mass of sediment lies stacked along the edge of the Norwegian continental shelf. It has accumulated over thousands of years, delivered by glaciers, rivers, and marine currents. Layer upon layer builds on a steep underwater slope until part of the margin becomes unstable. Around 8,150 years ago, roughly 6,200 BCE, that stability fails. The seabed begins to move. The collapse is not a cliff falling into visible water. It is a submarine landslide on a scale difficult to picture from the surface. Vast quantities of mud, sand, and debris accelerate downslope into the deep Norwegian Sea. The moving mass displaces an enormous volume of water, generating waves that spread outward across the North Atlantic and into the North Sea. This event is known as the Storegga tsunami, named after the Great Storegga Slide that produced it. Modern reconstructions show that the slide itself was more complicated than older accounts suggested. Deposits once grouped together as one enormous failure now appear to represent at least two major submarine landslides separated by roughly 12,000 years. An earlier event, sometimes identified with the Storegga Slide, occurred near the end of the Ice Age. The later Storegga failure generated the tsunami that struck Mesolithic coastlines. This revision does not make Storegga less catastrophic. It shows that the underwater landscape had a longer and more complex history of instability than a single dramatic collapse. The first visible sign for people near the coast may not have been a towering wave. In some places, the sea could have withdrawn unexpectedly as the changing water surface passed through the basin. Tidal flats may have widened within minutes. Boats or fish could have been left on exposed mud. Channels that normally held water might have emptied or flowed strangely. Such behavior is dangerous precisely because it can draw attention toward the shore before the main surge arrives. Then the water returns. The exact height and form of the tsunami vary according to coastline, water depth, seabed topography, and the shape of river valleys. A wave crossing deep water may not resemble the steep wall familiar from dramatic images. As it enters shallower areas, it slows, compresses, and rises. Narrow inlets can funnel the surge higher. Low plains allow it to spread far inland. Estuaries guide the force along channels that already penetrate the landscape. Evidence preserved around the North Sea shows how widely the tsunami travelled in western Norway, Scotland, the Shetland Islands, the Faroe Islands, and other coastal regions. Geologists have identified distinctive sand layers deposited inside peat, lake mud, or coastal sediments. These layers contain marine material carried beyond the normal reach of tides. Their age aligns with the Storegga event. In some locations, the deposits lie several meters above the contemporary shoreline, demonstrating that the surge climbed far beyond ordinary coastal flooding. Along parts of eastern Scotland, the tsunami may have penetrated deeply into river valleys and low coastal plains. Sand and marine organisms were swept across freshwater and terrestrial surfaces. Trees and vegetation could have been broken or buried. Water moving inland carried driftwood, stones, shells, mud, and debris. When the surge withdrew, it dragged material back toward the sea, scouring channels and leaving chaotic deposits behind. Doggerland was especially exposed because so much of its remaining terrain was low, fragmented, and surrounded by shallow water. By this time, it was no longer the immense connected plain of earlier millennia. Rising sea level had reduced it to islands, peninsulas, tidal wetlands, and elevated remnants. Some of these surviving areas may have stood only slightly above high tide. A tsunami entering such terrain would not need to rise to extraordinary height to cross large distances. Computer models suggest that parts of the southern North Sea could have experienced substantial inundation. Water may have surged across exposed islands, followed river channels, and flooded ground that had previously seemed secure. The precise reach remains debated because the final topography of Doggerland is imperfectly known. Small differences in reconstructed elevation can determine whether a wave stops at a ridge or passes over it. Sediments have also been eroded, compacted, or reworked during the 8 millennia since the event. For people living there, the catastrophe would have unfolded faster than any long-term sea level change they had known. The slow advance of the ocean allowed routes to be altered and camps relocated. A tsunami offered almost no such time. Water crossed familiar ground with unfamiliar speed. A valley that normally directed a river could become a path for the sea. An island sheltered from ordinary waves might be exposed to water arriving from several directions. There is no surviving eyewitness account, and the archaeological record cannot reveal the experiences of individual communities. It is possible to describe the physical processes without inventing precise scenes of suffering. What survives in the record suggests sudden inundation, erosion, destruction of vegetation, contamination of freshwater sources, and major disruption to coastal habitats. Camps, tools, food stores, boats, traps, and familiar landmarks could have been swept away or buried. Salt water may have remained in depressions after the main surge withdrew. The danger did not end when the wave passed. Tsunamis often arrive in multiple surges rather than one isolated crest. Water can return after an apparent pause. Strong currents continue to move through channels. Damaged banks collapse. Floating debris makes travel hazardous. People who reached higher ground may have had to remain there while tides and currents settled. Afterward, the surviving landscape would have looked altered even where the land itself remained. Reeds lay flattened. Tree trunks stood broken or stripped. Pools contained brackish water and marine debris. Animal paths disappeared beneath mud. Fish and shellfish may have been carried into places where they quickly died. Freshwater supplies could have been contaminated by salt and decaying organic material. Some ecological effects were temporary. Wetlands can recover, birds return, and vegetation recolonized disturbed ground. Other changes may have accelerated processes already underway. Eroded peat becomes more vulnerable to future tides. A breached ridge allows marine water into a basin that had previously remained freshwater. Channels cut by the surge can become permanent tidal routes. The tsunami therefore may have changed not only what people saw immediately after the disaster, but how water moved through Doggerland afterward. The social meaning of such an event is impossible to recover, yet it would be difficult for it to pass without leaving a deep cultural mark. Communities already familiar with advancing coastlines suddenly encountered water acting with overwhelming force. Stories of the event may have survived for generations, tied to submerged places, unusual deposits, or warnings about particular shores. Oral memory can preserve disasters long after their physical traces become difficult to recognize. Though no identifiable Doggerland tradition has survived into written history, Storegga's dramatic scale has encouraged a simple conclusion. One great wave destroyed Doggerland and ended its human occupation. The image is powerful because it gives the vanished country a single final moment. A stable homeland stands one day and disappears the next. Yet the geological and archaeological evidence does not support such a clean ending. Much of Doggerland had already been lost before the tsunami. Sea level rise had been narrowing and dividing the region for thousands of years. Some former lowlands were already estuaries or open water. Human communities had already altered routes, moved camps, and perhaps left many vulnerable areas. The wave struck a landscape in decline rather than an intact continent. Nor is it certain that the tsunami submerged every surviving part permanently. Higher islands and ridges may have remained above water. Some areas could have been flooded briefly and then re-emerged as the surge retreated. Sedimentary evidence and later reconstruction suggest that portions of the remaining landscape may have survived the event, at least for a time. The Storegga tsunami was catastrophic, but catastrophe is not identical to complete was catastrophic. But catastrophe is not identical to complete erasure. Its importance lies in the collision between two different kinds of change. One is slow, measured across centuries and millennia melting ice, rising oceans, expanding estuaries, shrinking land. The other arrives within hours, a submarine collapse, a wave crossing the sea, water surging across inhabited ground. Doggerland had adapted to the first process for generations. Storegga exposed how vulnerable the remaining world had become to the second. When the water finally withdrew, survivors may still have seen land around them. Fires could be rebuilt. Tools could be remade. New camps could be established. Yet the illusion of security would have been shattered. The sea had already been taking Doggerland slowly. Now, for one terrifying interval, it demonstrated how quickly it could reach almost anywhere. After the Storegga tsunami, Doggerland does not disappear from the map in one clean stroke. Some low areas are devastated, some coastlines are cut back, and some surviving communities may decide that rebuilding is no longer worth the risk. Yet higher ground remains. Islands and ridges still rise above the water. Tidal channels continue to offer fish and shellfish. Birds return to disturbed marshes. Vegetation begins to recover where salt and erosion have not permanently altered the soil. The great wave changes the human calculation, but it does not settle the fate of every place. This is where the story becomes less dramatic and more difficult. Archaeology rarely preserves a clear final departure. A settlement destroyed by fire may leave charcoal, collapsed walls, and broken objects sealed beneath debris. A mobile camp abandoned because a coastline has become unreliable may leave only a thin scatter of stone. People carry their best tools with them. Shelters decay, hearths erode, rising water removes the ground itself. The absence of later artifacts can indicate that a place was abandoned, but it cannot reveal exactly why, when, or how the decision was made. Several explanations compete, and they are not mutually exclusive. In some regions, the tsunami may have caused immediate displacement, a community losing shelters, boats, stored food, equipment, and access to fresh water could be forced to leave, even if the land technically remained above sea level. In other areas, people may have returned after the flood, repaired what they could, and continued living on surviving islands. Elsewhere, the final departure may have occurred decades or centuries later as ordinary sea level rise finished what Storegga had accelerated. The slow process remained relentless. By the time of the tsunami, the ocean had already reduced Doggerland to a fraction of its earlier size. Marine water occupied former river valleys. Low woodland had turned to marsh or tidal flat. Routes between communities depended increasingly on boats and favourable weather. Each additional rise in sea level reduced the margin of safety. A storm surge that once flooded only the shore could now cross an entire narrow island. Freshwater sources became harder to protect from salt, fuel, game, and plant foods were concentrated into smaller areas. An island can remain physically present while becoming economically unlivable. It may lack enough dry woodland for fuel. Deer populations may decline as habitat contracts. Freshwater pools can become brackish during storms. A small community might survive there seasonally but not throughout the year. The final phase of occupation may therefore involve shorter visits rather than continuous residence. Fishing parties return during productive months, gather shellfish, repair traps, and then leave before winter or storm season. This gradual reduction in use is nearly invisible archaeologically. A place occupied every year leaves fewer traces once visits become brief. A camp that once held several households may later serve only as a stopping point. Eventually, no one returns. There is no single moment of collapse, only a thinning of human presence until the landscape is inhabited mainly through memory. Migration toward Britain is one possibility, especially for communities using western Doggerland. This surviving eastern coast of Britain offered familiar ecological zones, river valleys, woodland, and connections with groups already living there. Movement may have followed older social networks rather than taking the form of strangers arriving all at once. Individuals and families could join relatives or exchange partners. Seasonal movement might gradually become permanent residents. The people crossing the remaining channels were not entering a completely unknown world. They were moving within a region that had been connected for generations. Others may have shifted toward the Low Countries, northern Germany, or southern Scandinavia. The direction of movement would depend on location, kinship, knowledge of routes, and the condition of neighbouring lands. There is no reason to expect all displaced communities to travel the same way. Doggerland had always linked several regions, and its final inhabitants may have dispersed along those same networks. The receiving landscapes were changing too. Rising sea level affected the entire North Sea basin. Estuaries expanded along the continental coast. Wetlands developed in low valleys. Britain's shoreline moved inward. Communities already living there had to adjust to many of the same pressures. Migrants from Doggerland did not arrive in a stable world untouched by flooding. They entered other changing coastlines where resources, territories, and social relationships were already being renegotiated. This may have encouraged cooperation, but it could also create tension. New arrivals bring knowledge, skills, tools, and relationships, yet they also need access to food, water, fuel, and camps. Archaeological evidence is not clear enough to reconstruct whether displacement led mainly to conflict, integration, or a mixture of both. Scholars still debate how population movement appears in Mesolithic artifact patterns. A new tool style might indicate migration, exchange, imitation, or changing practical needs. Genetic evidence from later human remains can show broad patterns of ancestry, but it cannot isolate a vanished Doggerland population with certainty. People living around the North Sea were already connected. Their genes, technologies, and customs had circulated across the region before the final flooding. When Doggerland's inhabitants moved outward, they may not have appeared as a separate people in the genetic record. They could have blended into neighbouring communities whose ancestry was already related. The tsunami itself may have intensified this dispersal by changing perceptions of risk. A place that remained productive after centuries of slow flooding could still feel worth inhabiting. After an overwhelming surge, the same place might seem dangerously exposed. Oral accounts of the wave would reinforce the memory that high ground was not always safe. Some communities may have abandoned islands not because they became immediately uninhabitable, but because the disaster revealed how vulnerable they were. Others may have stayed precisely because departure was difficult. Boats could be damaged, social connections elsewhere might be weak. The remaining coastal resources might still be abundant. Familiarity often outweighs abstract danger. People know where fish gather, where fuel can be found, and which channels are safest. Moving to another region means entering territories already used by others and abandoning knowledge accumulated over generations. The final residents of Doggerland may therefore have included people who are highly adapted to maritime life. They could move between islands, read tides, exploit estuaries, and maintain contact with distant shores. Their world was smaller than that of their ancestors, but it was not necessarily impoverished in every respect. Coastal ecosystems can support dense resources, and islands can become centres rather than isolated edges. Yet no adaptation could halt the rising sea. The early Holocene ocean continued to expand. Waves eroded exposed shores. Peat banks collapsed. Salt water entered remaining basins. Islands shrank from their edges inward. Ground that survived one decade became vulnerable in the next. The highest remnants offered time, not permanence. Some final areas may have endured beyond the Storegga event for centuries, perhaps as scattered islands within the growing North Sea. Their exact outlines remain uncertain because later marine erosion has removed much of the evidence. Older reconstructions sometimes imagined a single large island lingering in the centre, while newer models suggest a more complex pattern of ridges, wetlands, channels, and fragmented dry ground. A line drawn on a map can make the last land look stable, but in reality it may have been flooded during storms, divided at high tide, or too marshy for permanent occupation. The distinction between physical survival and human survival is important. Land can remain above average sea level while no longer supporting a community. Conversely, people may continue visiting an area after permanent settlement has ended. Doggerland's final archaeological date may therefore not equal the date when the last visible soil slipped beneath the waves. There was probably no single last camp that represented the whole region. One island may have been abandoned after the tsunami. Another may have remained a seasonal fishing ground. A higher ridge could support occupation until fresh water failed. Farther south, a marsh might be deserted centuries earlier because travel became too difficult. The end happened repeatedly in different places. This fragmented ending explains why the popular image of one wave erasing an entire country is so appealing and so misleading. Storegga provides a moment that can be pictured. Slow sea level rise provides a process. Human migration adds thousands of individual decisions that leave almost no trace. The true disappearance of Doggerland was created by all three. The wave destroyed, the ocean narrowed, people adapted, departed, returned, and eventually stopped returning. Their communities didn't vanish with the land. They moved into Britain and continental Europe, carrying technologies, relationships, memories, and perhaps stories of ground beneath the sea. What disappeared was not the population itself, but the possibility of continuing to live within the old landscape. By the time the final remnants were surrendered, Doggerland had already survived many endings. Forest had become marsh. Interior had become coast. Peninsulas had become islands. Routes had become channels. Permanent camps had become seasonal visits. The last disappearance was only the final stage of a much longer transformation. The sea eventually covered the remaining ground, smoothing its broken outlines beneath waves and sediment. From the new shores, people looked across water that had once contained paths, rivers, camps, and familiar horizons. Doggerland was gone from sight, but not necessarily from memory. Its inhabitants had left before the land itself was fully erased, carrying fragments of the vanished country into the human worlds that remained. Britain does not become an island at the instant the last camp in Doggerland is abandoned. The transformation has been underway for thousands of years, visible first in flooded valleys, widening estuaries, broken ridges, and longer water crossings. By the time the remaining fragments of Doggerland are no longer habitable, the geography of northwestern Europe has already changed beyond recognition. The old western edge of a continental world now stands apart behind a broadening sea. For earlier generations, movement between Britain and the lands to the east has been part of ordinary human geography. Routes could follow rivers, wooded ridges, wetlands, and coastlines across the basin. Even when rising water interrupted direct travel, islands and shallow channels may have preserved stages along the journey. Boats could replace some paths. Seasonal crossings could continue. Separation therefore developed by degrees, not through one final closing of a gate. Eventually, however, the distances became too great for casual movement. The disappearance of intermediate land meant that a journey once made in stages across familiar terrain required deliberate travel over open water, wind, waves, tides, visibility, and the condition of the vessel now determined whether people could cross. Contact remained possible, but it became more expensive, less predictable, and more dangerous. This difference altered social relationships. Communities in eastern Britain could no longer maintain every connection with the same frequency. Seasonal gathering places beneath the North Sea were lost. Familiar routes ended at the coast. Partnerships and exchanges that once required walking for several days might now depend on skilled boat crews and favourable weather. Some networks narrowed, while others reorganised around coastal navigation. Britain's inhabitants did not suddenly become isolated from Europe. Mesolithic people possessed the knowledge needed to move along rivers and coasts, and evidence from northern Europe shows that prehistoric communities were capable of substantial water travel. The sea was a barrier, but not an absolute one. Objects, ideas, and people could still cross. The important change was that connection was no longer built into the land itself. This altered the meaning of the coastline. The eastern shore had once opened onto a continuation of the inhabited landscape. Now it faced water covering old valleys and camps. Coastal environments became central places of food production and travel, but they also marked the edge of dependable walking routes, estuaries, mudflats, offshore islands, and tidal channels demanded specialized knowledge. People living near them became increasingly maritime, not because the sea was new, but because it had moved into the center of their world. Settlement patterns shifted with the new geography. River valleys within Britain remained important, offering fresh water, fish, woodland, and routes inland. Coastal sites provided shellfish, birds, marine mammals in some regions, and access to waterborne travel. Communities could move seasonally between shore and interior, using different resources as conditions changed. The disappearance of Doggerland did not cause a retreat from the coast. In many places, the newly formed coast became one of the richest parts of the landscape, yet the total territory available to Britain's hunter-gatherers had contracted. Vast lowlands east of the modern shoreline were gone. River systems were shortened. Wetlands that once extended across the North Sea basin now ended at marine estuaries. productive habitats had disappeared beneath water, while others formed along the new shore. The ecological balance changed rather than simply becoming poorer. Animals faced the same separation. During the period of dry land, species could move between Britain and continental Europe as habitats expanded or retreated. Herds followed vegetation, predators followed prey. Smaller animals spread through woodland and grassland without crossing open sea. Once Britain became an island, this movement was restricted. The result shaped Britain's fauna. Species already present could survive if climate and habitat remained suitable. But animals absent at the moment of separation could no longer recolonize easily. Local extinctions became more permanent. Populations trapped on the island might become smaller and more genetically isolated. Some large mammals later disappeared through a combination of environmental change, human pressure, and the limits imposed by insularity. Though scholars still debate the relative importance of each cause, plants also responded to the new boundary. Seeds can travel by birds, wind, driftwood, and human movement. So the sea does not stop every species. Yet the rate and pattern of colonization change when continuous ground disappears. Britain's post-glacial forests developed within increasing isolation, influenced by soil, climate, animal browsing, and human activity. The ecological history of the island began to diverge from that of continental Europe. For human communities, the psychological change may have been as important as the physical one. Earlier people could imagine the eastern landscape as a continuation of known country, even when they had never travelled its full extent. Later generations inherited stories of drowned ground but grew up with a sea horizon. What has been a recent environmental transformation gradually became normal geography. Memories of Doggerland may have survived for generations, but oral traditions change as they are retold. A flooded river valley can become a story of a lost island. A tsunami can become an account of water crossing the land. A gradual retreat can be compressed into one ancestral catastrophe. There is no surviving tradition that can be securely identified as a memory of Doggerland, and any direct claim would be speculative. Still, landscapes lost within human timescales rarely vanish from culture without leaving some form of remembrance. Britain's new island status did not create one unified identity. Mesolithic communities remained diverse, mobile, and connected through regional networks. People in Scotland, Wales, southern England, and eastern river systems inhabited very different environments. Mountains, forests, and distance could separate groups as effectively as the sea. The island existed geographically before it existed as a single social idea. The new boundary nevertheless shaped later history. When farming communities began arriving from continental Europe thousands of years after Doggerland's disappearance, they came by boat. Their movement demonstrates that the sea did not prevent major migration. It changed its organization. Crossing required planning, vessels, knowledge, and social connections strong enough to support a journey across water. These later arrivals brought domesticated animals, crops, new technologies, and different forms of settlement. Ancient DNA indicates that Britain's transition to farming involved substantial migration from continental populations, rather than only the adoption of agriculture by existing hunter-gatherers. The sea had separated Britain, but it had not sealed it. Human movement continued whenever cultural, demographic, or economic forces were strong enough to cross the water. This pattern would repeat throughout later millennia. Traders, settlers, raiders, armies, and travellers crossed the surrounding seas again and again. Britain's insularity offered protection in some periods and exposure in others. The same water that slowed movement also created maritime routes. Geography influenced history without determining it completely. Doggerland remained beneath these later crossings. Neolithic boats, Bronze Age traders, Roman fleets, medieval ships, fishing vessels, and modern cargo carriers passed over a country whose existence had been forgotten. The new island world developed above the submerged roots of the old continental one. The severing of Britain from Europe was therefore not merely a change in coastline, it reorganized ecosystems, human networks, and the scale of movement. It turned ordinary journeys into sea crossings. It made local extinction harder to reverse. It encouraged new coastal adaptations while removing an enormous inhabited landscape from use. Britain became an island slowly enough that no single generation witnessed the full transformation. One community knew a peninsula, another inherited an island chain. Later people knew only the sea. By the time the modern outline of Britain had become familiar, Doggerland's rivers were buried, its forests drowned, and its paths replaced by tides. The land bridge had vanished, and with it disappeared the geography that had once made Britain part of a continuous human world. The country beneath the North Sea is no longer beyond reach, but neither is it waiting intact to be uncovered. Doggerland survives as buried valleys, compressed peat, scattered artifacts, ancient DNA, and fragments of land surface sealed beneath marine sediment. Its archaeology is spread across an area too large to excavate in any conventional sense. Researchers cannot drain the sea, expose the old rivers, and walk from site to site. They must investigate indirectly, selecting narrow windows into a landscape whose scale exceeds most terrestrial archaeological projects. Every offshore survey therefore begins with uncertainty. A buried channel may once have guided animals and people, but it may also contain no preserved evidence of occupation. A ridge beside an ancient wetland may have been an ideal campsite, yet later erosion may have removed its surface entirely. Another site may remain nearly untouched beneath sand only a few kilometers away. Preservation underwater is not uniformly poor. In some places, the sea destroys. In others, rapid burial creates conditions that protect organic material better than ordinary dry ground. This is why Doggerland has become one of archaeology's greatest opportunities and one of its most difficult responsibilities. Waterlogged sediments can preserve plant remains, wood, bone, pollen, microscopic organisms, and genetic fragments that would decay on land. Peat can hold an environmental record extending across centuries. Buried riverbanks may retain undisturbed surfaces where tools, animal remains, and traces of repeated human use still lie in place. A single intact site could reveal far more about Mesolithic life than hundreds of artifacts recovered without context. Finding such a site requires precision. Seismic mapping identifies promising landforms. Sediment cores test whether ancient surfaces survive. Environmental evidence shows whether an area was dry, marshy, wooded, or marine at a particular time. Predictive models then help archaeologists choose where more detailed surveys might succeed. The aim is no longer merely to prove that Doggerland existed. That question is settled. The challenge is to locate places where people lived within it and recover evidence before those places are damaged or lost. Modern offshore development has made that challenge urgent. The North Sea is not a quiet archaeological reserve. It is crossed by pipelines, communication cables, shipping lanes, and fishing fleets. Sand and gravel are extracted for construction and coastal defence. Wind farms require foundations, service routes, and extensive seabed surveys. Each activity can disturb buried deposits, but each can also generate new information. Before major offshore construction, developers may conduct geophysical and geological investigations to understand the seabed. These surveys can reveal ancient river systems and preserved sediment sequences at a level of detail archaeologists could rarely afford independently. When archaeological assessment is integrated early, industrial data can help identify sensitive zones and guide decisions about avoidance, sampling, or recovery. The relationship is uneasy but productive. The same infrastructure that threatens submerged heritage may provide the tools needed to locate it. Bottom trawling creates a different problem. Fishing gear dragged across the seabed can expose artifacts and bones, but it can also break, move, and scatter them. An object brought up in a net may be saved from further erosion, yet its precise position within the archaeological landscape is usually lost. Dredging does the same on a larger scale, removing sediment and transporting it elsewhere. A flint discovered on a nourished beach may have originated from an offshore deposit many kilometers away. For this reason, location data have become almost as valuable as the object itself, a barbed point with accurate coordinates, depth, associated sediment, and recovery history can be connected to mapped landforms and dated environmental sequences. The same point without context remains impressive but scientifically limited. Archaeologists increasingly work with fishing communities, dredging companies, engineers, and citizen collectors to record discoveries before vital information disappears. Projects such as Subnautica represent the new scale of this effort. By combining archaeology, marine geology, environmental science, computer modeling, and artificial intelligence, researchers are attempting to identify submerged prehistoric landscapes across the North Sea and Baltic region. Existing industrial archives can be searched alongside newly collected data. Algorithms can detect recurring features within enormous seismic datasets, flagging buried channels, terraces, and preserved surfaces for closer examination. Artificial intelligence does not solve the archaeological problem by itself. A computer can recognize a shape, but it cannot determine whether a particular ridge mattered to Mesolithic people. Human interpretation remains necessary to connect geology, ecology, chronology, and behavior. The value of these systems lies in narrowing a vast search area. They allow researchers to ask better questions of a seabed that cannot be investigated meter by meter. Sedimentary DNA is also changing what counts as archaeological evidence. The forest revealed in a core may contain no visible wood, leaves, or seeds. Its existence can be detected through genetic fragments released by organisms thousands of years ago. Combined with pollen and sediment analysis, these traces restore biological communities that once seemed inaccessible. In time, similar methods may identify more detailed patterns of animal presence or human influence, though claims of direct human DNA from open environmental sediments require exceptional caution because contamination and movement through layers can be difficult to exclude. The strongest future discoveries may come not from one spectacular artifact, but from combinations of subtle evidence. A buried river terrace might contain microscopic charcoal, worked flint, animal proteins, plant residues, and changes in sediment caused by repeated trampling. None would be decisive alone. Together, they might reveal a camp where people returned season after season. Doggerland has already taught researchers to value patterns over isolated wonders. Its deeper Pleistocene landscapes extend the story far beyond the final Mesolithic inhabitants. Systems such as the submerged Paleo-Yar preserve evidence from periods when earlier humans moved through northern Europe under very different climates. Flint artifacts and ancient landforms beneath the southern North Sea suggest that the region served as human habitat and migration territory across repeated glacial and interglacial cycles. Doggerland is therefore not one lost country belonging to one moment. It is a stack of vanished landscapes, repeatedly exposed, inhabited, altered, and submerged over immense spans of time. This depth makes the seabed a missing archive of European prehistory. Many questions that seem puzzling on land may reflect the disappearance of evidence offshore. Sparse early Mesolithic sites in parts of Britain could result partly from the fact that attractive lowland settlements now lie beneath the sea. Apparent gaps in migration routes may exist because the connecting terrain has been removed from view. The modern coastline has shaped archaeological interpretation by hiding some of the richest ground. The 2026 evidence for early habitable forests sharpens this possibility. If parts of southern Doggerland supported oak, elm, hazel, and other woodland communities from roughly 16,000 years ago, then the landscape may have offered ecological refuges and attractive living conditions earlier than previously assumed. Human occupation remains to be demonstrated directly at many of these locations, but the old assumption that the basin was merely a cold, exposed corridor is no longer adequate. Doggerland's legacy also reaches beyond archaeology. It offers a clear example of how climate change reshapes human geography without asking permission from the people living within it. The warming after the Ice Age was natural in origin and unfolded over thousands of years. Unlike the rapid human-driven warming of the present, the comparison must not be simplified. Yet the drowned landscape still demonstrates how rising seas can transform not only shorelines but routes, economies, ecosystems, identities, and memory. A coastline can move gradually and still produce profound disruption. Loss begins before land is fully submerged. Salt reaches fresh water. Wetlands expand. Paths fail. Communities become separated. Productive environments may appear temporarily, encouraging people to stay even as long-term risk increases. Extreme events then strike landscapes already weakened by slow change. Storegga matters not because one tsunami explains everything, but because sudden disaster and gradual environmental pressure can reinforce one another. Doggerland also warns against describing displaced people as if they simply vanish. Its inhabitants did not disappear with the land. They moved into other parts of Britain and continental Europe, joined existing communities, carried knowledge, and continued their lives. The archaeological map lost a region, but human ancestry and culture continued beyond it. The catastrophe was the destruction of a homeland, not the extinction of its people. What may have vanished most completely was the structure of memory tied to place. River names, stories, burial grounds, seasonal routes, and explanations for the advancing water survived only as long as communities continued to tell them. Once the geography changed beyond recognition, those memories may have weakened, transformed, or merged with later traditions. No modern story can be confidently traced back to Doggerland. Its cultural archive is almost entirely silent. Scientific reconstruction now creates a new kind of memory. Rivers without surviving names return as map channels. Forests reappear through pollen and DNA. Human presence emerges through antler, stone, and bone. The lost country is being remembered by people separated from it by 8,000 years, using techniques its inhabitants could never have imagined. There is something fitting in the way Doggerland returns. It does not rise from the sea in one dramatic discovery. It emerges slowly, as the land itself disappeared slowly. A new core adds a wetland. A seismic survey restores a valley. A fragment of DNA brings back a tree. A barbed point returns the presence of a human hand. Each clue enlarges the world beneath the water, while also revealing how much remains unknown. The final map will never be complete. Some surfaces were destroyed during inundation. Others have been removed by currents, trawling, or construction. Many human traces were made from materials that decayed before the sea arrived. The evidence that survives is filtered by chance. Scholars will continue to debate coastlines, settlement density, migration, and the final stages of occupation because uncertainty is built into the landscape itself. Still, Doggerland no longer belongs only to speculation. It was land. It held rivers, forests, marshes, animals, and people. It changed through warming, flooding, adaptation, and catastrophe. It connected Britain with Europe before the sea transformed that connection. Its disappearance helped create the geography later generations accepted as permanent. Above it now move container ships, fishing vessels, ferries, and the slow blades of offshore wind turbines. Storms cross the open water. Tides work endlessly over banks and channels. Beneath them, the old country remains, not preserved as a perfect ruin, but distributed through layers of sediment and time. The horizon looks empty only because the evidence lies below it. And so the story widens beyond one drowned landscape. Human history is filled with places that seemed permanent to those who knew them. Rivers that changed course, lakes that dried, coasts that retreated, forests that became desert, cities abandoned beneath silt and sand. People build their lives inside temporary arrangements of climate and geography, though those arrangements often last long enough to feel eternal. Doggerland makes that fragility visible. Its inhabitants woke beneath familiar skies, followed remembered paths, and returned to places used by earlier generations. The land beneath their feet had the weight of certainty. A river was a river, a forest was a forest. The horizon promised distance, not disappearance. Then the water entered slowly. It filled the lowest ground, widened the estuaries, divided the paths, and turned remembered places into islands. People adjusted. They moved their camps, changed their routes, crossed by boat, and continued. The world became smaller, but life went on. Even after the great wave came from the north, there were places where fires could still be lit. At last, the remaining ground became too narrow, too wet, or too isolated. The final visitors departed. Tides moved over abandoned camps. Sand covered peat. Marine mud settled into old channels. Trees fell beneath shallow water, and the sea erased the view of the country without erasing every trace. Thousands of years passed. Memory faded. Britain became an island that seemed always to have been one. The North Sea became an ordinary fact of the map, but beneath its surface roots still remain in ancient soil. Pollen rests inside peat. Rivers continue as dark shapes under sediment. A tool waits where someone last carried it through a world of woodland and marsh. The sea moves above that country now, cold and restless, reflecting clouds that once passed over dry land. Far below, Doggerland keeps its silence not empty, not forgotten, but suspended between loss and rediscovery, holding the fragile memory of a human world beneath the waves.